The courtroom was buzzing with the low hum of conversation. A typical day in the heart of the city's legal system. The judge, a stout man with round glasses and a thin mustache, drummed his fingers on the polished wooden surface of the bench, clearly bored. At the defense table sat Clint Eastwood, arms crossed, his face an impenetrable mask. He wasn't here for some Hollywood stunt or to make headlines. This wasn't a scene in one of his famous westerns. But you wouldn't know that by the way people were looking at him. The judge cleared his throat, adjusting his glasses before speaking. Mr. Eastwood, we all know who you are. But this court is not a place for celebrities to play games. Do you understand? Clint didn't flinch. He dealt with worse, far worse, than a sarcastic judge on a power trip. The lawyer sitting across from him, a slick, middle-aged man in a dark suit, was leaning back in his chair, smirking as he flipped through his legal pad. You may be a big star, Mr. Eastwood, but in this courtroom, we play by the rules, the lawyer said, his tone dripping with condescension. Clint's steely blue eyes flicked toward the lawyer, then back to the judge. It was clear from the look on his face that Clint wasn't used to this kind of treatment. He had dealt with a lot of adversaries in his life, on screen and off, but this was a different kind of fight. The judge was more interested in making a name for himself than seeking justice. And the lawyer? He was just looking for an easy win by making Clint look like a fool. The dispute at hand wasn't even major. It was a simple car accident. Clint's car had been hit by a reckless driver, and he was here to settle the damages. But it wasn't the accident that had brought Clint into this courtroom. It was the constant underestimation. The way people assumed his age and fame made him an easy target, that he wouldn't fight back. But Clint wasn't just any celebrity. He wasn't just some washed-up actor trying to buy his way out of trouble. He was Clint Eastwood. The man had lived through more trials, both literal and metaphorical, than most people could ever dream of. And what no one knew was that Clint's involvement in this case was part of something much bigger than any courtroom drama. Mr. Eastwood, the judge continued, still not taking him seriously, I'm afraid you'll need to follow the court's procedure. Your star status doesn't exempt you from that. The crowd, which had been murmuring in curiosity about Clint's presence, now seemed to settle into a judgmental silence. Some watched in amusement, others with indifference. They were all waiting for the celebrity to either collapse under the pressure or pull some sort of stunt. After all, they all thought they knew Clint Eastwood, the rugged actor, the tough guy who stood tall in every movie role. But they had no idea who Clint really was. The judge's eyes narrowed as he adjusted his position. He leaned forward, his gaze fixed on Clint. Mr. Eastwood, you've made your claim, but I'm afraid you failed to convince this court that there's any substance to your story. So, unless you have something substantial to present, Clint interrupted, his voice low but firm. I have something substantial. The courtroom went silent. Even the judge paused, raising an eyebrow at Clint's unexpected interruption. Is that so, Mr. Eastwood? The judge's voice was laced with sarcasm, though his eyes were sharp. He clearly didn't expect Clint to have anything else up his sleeve. Clint's lips twitched, but his expression remained serious. Slowly, he reached inside his tailored jacket, and for a moment, the audience thought he might pull out a statement or some kind of legal document. But no. Instead, he pulled out a small badge and placed it on the table with a soft clink. The courtroom collectively gasped. The judge's eyes widened as he leaned forward, squinting at the shiny object. What is that? He asked, his voice suddenly devoid of its previous arrogance. The smirk that had been playing at the lawyer's lips was now replaced by confusion. Clint didn't respond immediately. He simply leaned back in his chair, allowing the silence to build. The badge, gleaming under the overhead lights, was clearly official. It wasn't some proper joke. This was real. The judge swallowed hard, his face now growing red. Mr. Eastwood, what is that? He asked again, his voice losing some of its former confidence. Clint remained calm. It's my United States Secret Service badge, he said evenly. I've been working undercover for the past few years. I'm not just here as Clint Eastwood, the actor. I'm here as Clint Eastwood, a special agent for the U.S. Secret Service. The lawyer's jaw dropped, and for a moment, the entire courtroom was frozen. People shifted in their seats, trying to process what had just been revealed. No one could believe it. Clint Eastwood? An undercover agent for the Secret Service? It sounded impossible. And yet, the badge on the table was undeniable. The judge, now flustered and visibly sweating, stammered, You can't be serious. What are you trying to? Clint cut him off with a single, sharp look. I'm as serious as I've ever been, he said, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. And you should know, this case you've been laughing off is far more serious than you think. The mood in the courtroom shifted. What had started as a typical, albeit odd, civil case had just turned into something entirely different. The judge was no longer in control. The lawyer, who had been so confident just moments ago, now seemed unsure of his next move. Clint didn't need to explain further. The room could feel the gravity of the situation. This wasn't just a car accident anymore. This was about national security, about danger that none of them were prepared for. For a long, tense moment, no one spoke. Then, the judge broke the silence with a shaky voice. Mr. Eastwood, I need to call a recess. We'll reconvene shortly. As the courtroom erupted into whispers, Clint stood up, collecting his things with deliberate slowness. He didn't glance at the judge, didn't look at the lawyer. He simply walked out of the courtroom, leaving behind a stunned and confused audience. But as Clint made his way down the hall, his mind was already racing. The revelation of his secret life as a special agent wasn't the only bombshell he was about to drop. He wasn't just here for the car accident. There was a much larger conspiracy at play, one that involved corruption, power, and a dangerous syndicate that Clint had been tracking for months. And it all began right here. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Clint Eastwood wasn't always the hardened, iconic actor most people saw on screen. He wasn't always the man who stood tall in front of a camera, delivering lines with a growl and a steely glare. Before the movie roles, before the fame, Clint was just a kid trying to make his way in the world, trying to carve out a life in a city that seemed indifferent to his presence. Born in 1930 in San Francisco, Clint grew up in a modest household. His father, a decorated police officer, instilled in him a deep sense of justice, but also an understanding of the rough realities of life. There were no silver spoons, no easy rides in Clint's childhood. He learned early on that the world wasn't going to hand him anything. He would have to fight for it. As a teenager, Clint found solace in the quiet moments of reflection, often taking long walks along the coastline, gazing out over the Pacific. The wind would whip through his hair, the salt in the air grounding him in the reality of his life. But in those moments, he felt a pull, a desire for something greater than the everyday struggles of his neighborhood. Clint's father had served in World War II, and his stories of bravery and sacrifice inspired Clint more than anything else. He admired the grit and resilience of his father's generation, especially the men who had returned from the war to rebuild their lives. That sense of duty, of serving something greater than oneself, was a value Clint held onto throughout his life. After high school, Clint joined the Army during the Korean War. While he wasn't deployed to the front lines, his time in the military shaped him in ways he would later draw on in his career. The discipline, the sense of camaraderie, and the realization that life was fragile left a lasting impact on him. His service wasn't glamorous, but it taught him the harsh realities of the world, and it solidified his desire to stand for something meaningful. When Clint returned from his service, he pursued a career in acting, hoping to find a way to express himself through film. It wasn't an immediate success. He took on small roles, often playing the quiet, stoic type, the kind of man who didn't say much but commanded attention with a single look. His breakout role in the TV show Rawhide marked the beginning of his rise to fame, but it wasn't just his acting that made him a household name. It was the depth and authenticity he brought to his characters. As Clint's fame grew, so did his understanding of the darker side of life. Hollywood, with all its glitz and glamour, also had its underbelly. He quickly realized that in the world of fame and power, appearances could be deceiving. And it was that realization that led him to take a step into a world that most people never saw. The world of undercover law enforcement. It wasn't an easy decision. Clint had already carved out a successful career in Hollywood, and stepping into the shadows of law enforcement would be a far cry from the limelight of movie premieres and red carpets. But Clint had always believed that life had more to offer than fame. He had a sense of duty, a sense of justice that went beyond acting. His first brush with law enforcement came when he was approached by the Secret Service during a movie shoot. Clint had always been interested in the mechanics of government and security, but he never imagined it would lead to him working with the United States Secret Service. The Secret Service had been tracking a growing network of criminal organizations, some of which had infiltrated the highest levels of government. They needed someone who could go unnoticed, someone who could blend into society while gathering intelligence. Clint, with his acting background and ability to change his appearance and demeanor on a dime, was the perfect candidate. At first, it was meant to be a side gig, something that would allow him to use his fame for a greater cause. But as the years went by, Clint became more and more deeply involved in the world of national security. The cases grew more complex, the stakes higher. What began as an occasional role in undercover operations eventually became Clint's second life, one he kept hidden from the public and even from many of his closest friends. Despite his fame, Clint learned to balance both worlds. He used his Hollywood connections to gain access to places and people that others couldn't. He gathered intelligence, helped take down dangerous criminals, and quietly assisted in thwarting major national security threats. But the strain of living two lives was beginning to show. Clint's friends and colleagues in Hollywood were starting to notice that he was becoming more distant, more aloof. They attributed it to age or his growing disinterest in acting. But Clint knew the truth. He was becoming entangled in something far more dangerous than the fictional characters he portrayed on screen. One of the people who had noticed his shift was his close friend, Peter, a fellow actor who had worked with Clint for years. Peter had always been the kind of guy who knew when something was off. He had seen Clint go from the charming leading man to a man who carried a quiet weight on his shoulders. One night, over drinks, Peter asked Clint what was really going on. Clint had avoided the question for years, but that night, something in him snapped. He told Peter everything about his work with the Secret Service, about the dangers he faced, and about the conspiracy he had been tracking. Peter, to his credit, didn't laugh or question him. Instead, he promised to keep Clint's secret. As Clint's involvement in national security deepened, the risks grew. He had been called upon to investigate everything from domestic terrorism to high-profile government corruption. The things he had uncovered in the shadows were enough to make anyone question everything they knew about the world. But Clint never backed down. He was a man of principle, a man who understood that the pursuit of justice often came at a high cost. And despite the weight of it all, despite the personal sacrifices he had made along the way, Clint knew that what he was doing mattered. He wasn't just another actor in a fake world. He was a man who had chosen to fight for something real. As the years passed, Clint began to wonder how much longer he could keep up the charade. The line between his two worlds was blurring. The stakes were getting higher, and Clint knew that sooner or later, his two lives would collide. And that collision was about to happen in the most unexpected way. The courtroom had gone silent after Clint's dramatic reveal of his Secret Service badge. The murmurs of confusion and disbelief echoed through the hall as the tension in the room thickened. For a moment, Clint could feel the weight of everyone's gaze on him, on his past, on his choices, and on what was coming next. The judge, who moments before had been smug and dismissive, was now visibly shaken. His face had lost its earlier bravado, his previous attempts at mockery replaced with unease. Clint didn't give him the satisfaction of a response. He remained calm, his posture relaxed, though his mind was racing. The weight of the situation was slowly dawning on him. He had just revealed a crucial part of his life that no one, not even his closest friends, knew about. His time as a special agent was supposed to remain a secret, a carefully guarded truth. But now, there was no turning back. The recess the judge had called came and went quickly. Clint didn't leave the courtroom immediately, instead staying seated at the defense table, his hands clasped together. His lawyer, a sharp and confident woman named Jessica Cartwright, approached him with a quiet, serious look on her face. "You did that on purpose, didn't you?" she asked, her voice just loud enough for him to hear. Clint didn't flinch. "They needed to know who they were dealing with," he said softly, keeping his eyes trained on the judge. "I didn't have a choice." They were laughing at me, dismissing me like I was just some has-been actor. But they don't understand what's really at stake here. Jessica studied Clint for a moment, her sharp mind trying to piece together the situation. This isn't just about a car accident, is it? She asked, almost rhetorically. Clint's gaze finally moved from the judge to Jessica. No, he said, his voice quiet but filled with conviction. It's about much more than that. The trial had started as a mundane legal battle over a minor car accident, one that Clint had almost forgotten about in the grand scheme of his life. But now, it was clear to him that this was just the beginning of something far larger and more dangerous. Clint had spent the last several years working on a covert mission with the Secret Service, tracking down a sophisticated criminal syndicate involved in everything from money laundering to arms trafficking. And though he had hoped the worst was behind him, the truth was that the syndicate had tentacles reaching into every part of the government, some of the highest echelons, including law enforcement. The moment Clint had flashed his badge, he had unwittingly opened a door. He wasn't just going to fight over a fender bender anymore. He had just triggered something far more dangerous. Jessica leaned in closer. Clint, she said quietly, we need to get you out of here. This could get out of hand really fast. I know, Clint replied, his mind already moving forward, piecing together what had just happened. But I can't leave. Not now. The courtroom doors opened, and the judge entered, clearly rattled, followed by the prosecutor, a sharp, young man named Michael Sanders. The courtroom fell silent once again as the judge took his seat, his eyes shifting from Clint to the badge on the table and back to Clint's calm face. We'll reconvene, the judge announced, though his tone was much less authoritative than before. But I must insist that we all remain professional moving forward. Mr. Eastwood, your credentials are noted, but I would like to remind you that this is still a court of law. We will proceed with the case. Clint didn't say a word, but something in his eyes made the judge hesitate for a moment before he continued. Sanders, the prosecutor, was visibly unsettled, but tried to maintain his composure. Your Honor, he began, while Mr. Eastwood's claim to be part of the Secret Service is still highly unusual, the facts of this case remain. We are here to discuss the accident, not delve into his past. That being said, I do believe a recess is in order to verify the information presented. Clint could see the wheels turning in Sanders' head. He was either trying to play it cool, or he was already plotting a way to use Clint's revelation against him. Either way, Clint knew Sanders wasn't going to let this go lightly. But Clint had no choice. The stakes had just risen far beyond a simple car accident. I've said all I need to say, Clint responded, his voice calm but carrying an unmistakable edge. If you want to verify my identity, by all means. But this case doesn't stop here. There's something bigger going on, something that's connected to this. He nodded toward the car accident claim. And I can't let that slide. The judge, still a bit shaken, nodded reluctantly. Proceed then, Mr. Eastwood, he said, his earlier smugness replaced with wariness. The tension in the room was palpable. Jessica gave Clint a pointed look, but he didn't break eye contact with the judge. He knew that everything was about to spiral into something far more dangerous. The prosecutor turned to Jessica. So, what exactly is your client suggesting? That the accident was a diversion? Clint's eyes hardened, the cold steel of a man who had seen it all creeping into his expression. No, he said simply. The accident was the signal. There's a bigger game being played. And if you're not careful, you're all going to be caught up in it. It was the first time Clint had said it aloud, and the words hung in the air like a weight. The entire room was silent for a moment, each person processing the implications. The judge cleared his throat, regaining his composure. Mr. Eastwood, he began slowly, are you suggesting that this accident was orchestrated by a criminal organization? Clint's gaze didn't waver. I'm saying it's possible. I've been investigating a syndicate that's been infiltrating major sectors. And the accident? It's just the beginning. You're going to want to dig deeper than just who ran a red light. The prosecutor's eyes narrowed as he took a step closer to Clint. And what exactly do you want from this court? You want us to believe that this accident is connected to some criminal conspiracy just because you've worn a badge for a few years? I want you to start paying attention, Clint replied. I'm not asking for your belief. I'm asking for your cooperation. This isn't just about damages. It's about uncovering a much darker reality. And if you think you're safe in this courtroom, you're wrong." Clint's words hung heavy in the air. The conflict was no longer just about a minor legal dispute. It was about exposing something far more dangerous, and Clint could feel the walls closing in. He wasn't sure how far the corruption reached, but he knew this case was the tip of the iceberg. The courtroom had just become ground zero for a battle no one in the room was prepared for. Jessica leaned in again, her voice urgent. "Clint, we need to get out of here. This isn't a game anymore." Clint's gaze remained fixed ahead, unflinching. "Not yet. I need them to see what they're up against." And with that, the battle lines were drawn. The courtroom was a buzz of whispers and uneasy glances. Clint could feel it, the tension in the air, thick and suffocating. Everyone was wondering, was he telling the truth? Or was he just another celebrity whose delusions were now spilling out in front of a judge? But Clint knew something that they didn't. He knew that this moment was far bigger than any one courtroom drama. His life, the Secret Service, the stakes. It was all about to collide in ways he couldn't predict. Jessica sat next to him, her brow furrowed as she processed the magnitude of what Clint had just laid on the table. She wasn't a conspiracy theorist, but there was something about Clint's demeanor, his unshakable calm, that told her this wasn't a stunt. His acting skills were legendary, but this felt different. His words had weight. "Clint," she whispered urgently, leaning closer, "we need to figure out what happens next. If this case goes public, there's no telling what kind of backlash you'll face." Clint looked at her, his piercing blue eyes steady. "It's not about me, Jess. It's bigger than that. These guys, they're not just running a criminal empire. They've infiltrated almost every level of the system, and now they're playing a much larger game." Jessica leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms, her thoughts racing. She had always known Clint was more than just the gruff cowboy or action hero everyone saw on the silver screen. But this revelation was something she couldn't have predicted. He had just opened a door that, once opened, couldn't be shut. The judge had called for a brief recess, which, to Clint's annoyance, felt like an eternity. In this room, every second dragged on, and each passing minute only made the danger more real. He was accustomed to waiting, to moving in and out of shadows, but now, the waiting felt heavier. He was tangled up in something that had grown far beyond a mere courtroom dispute. The judge's words from earlier rang in his ears. This is still a court of law. But Clint knew what was at stake. This wasn't just a legal matter anymore. There were far more dangerous forces at play, and Clint couldn't afford to ignore the signals. A minor car accident had been the perfect trigger, small enough to draw attention, but enough to reveal a deep web of corruption. A web he had been tracking for months, possibly longer. As Jessica gathered her things, Clint noticed something strange. His former co-star, Peter, had entered the back of the courtroom. Clint had never mentioned anything about his double life to Peter, but it seemed the man had picked up on the undercurrents of Clint's secrecy over the years. Peter had always been the more easygoing, charismatic guy in their circle, the type to charm anyone with a quick smile and a warm handshake. But today, his easygoing attitude seemed gone. His eyes flickered with something more serious as they met Clint's. He nodded briefly, a silent acknowledgement of Clint's complicated life that spoke volumes. "Clint, you okay?" Peter's voice was low as he sidled up beside him. He was playing it cool, but Clint could see the concern behind his casual tone. "I will be," Clint replied, his eyes scanning the room, the air thick with an unspoken understanding. "But right now, I need you to do something for me." Peter raised an eyebrow. "Anything? I need you to get in touch with a few people from the old days," Clint said, his voice steady but urgent. "Not the Hollywood crowd. The other crowd. The ones who can help us uncover what's really going on behind the scenes." Peter gave him a long look, his brow furrowing in thought. Then, without another word, he turned and moved off toward the back of the room, leaving Clint to keep his focus on the chaos unfolding in front of him. Jessica gave Clint a glance before standing up. "I'll go see if I can get a word with the judge's clerk. Maybe we can figure out a way to stall this trial while we gather more evidence." Clint nodded, appreciative of her pragmatism. She was already thinking ahead, planning the next move in a game that was far more dangerous than a simple court case. She knew Clint had been in plenty of tight spots before, but this one felt different. The door to the courtroom swung open, and the prosecutor, Michael Sanders, walked in, his steps purposeful and deliberate. Clint didn't need to be told what was going on. The young prosecutor had been trying to dig into his background since the moment Clint had flashed his badge. Clint had seen that look before. The one that said, "I'm not buying it." The one that signaled trouble ahead. "You've got some explaining to do, Mr. Eastwood," Sanders said, his voice measured but tinged with irritation. "This stunt you pulled isn't going to fly. You don't just waltz in here, claiming to be a federal agent and expect this court to take you seriously. We'll get the facts on your Secret Service credentials. But right now, we're still here to talk about a car accident. And that's what I'm interested in." Clint's gaze hardened, but he remained calm. "It's all connected, Sanders. You'll see that soon enough." For a moment, the two men locked eyes. Clint could tell that Sanders wasn't a man who liked being challenged. But Clint had no time to play games. He had to keep the pressure on, make sure Sanders understood that this wasn't just a simple courtroom drama. If Clint could shift the narrative, he might be able to steer things in a direction that gave him the upper hand. "We both know this accident wasn't just some random event," Clint continued, his voice lowering. "The people involved aren't who they seem. It's not about property damage or insurance claims. It's about what comes next. And trust me, you don't want to be on the wrong side of this." Sanders scoffed. "You're bluffing, Eastwood. I'm not intimidated by whatever dangerous game you think you're playing." Clint didn't respond immediately. He didn't need to. His presence alone, calm, unwavering, the man who had lived multiple lives, spoke volumes. He knew Sanders was rattled, even if he wasn't showing it. Clint had been in the field with the best, and he could tell when someone was pretending. Suddenly, the courtroom doors opened, and the judge walked back in. There was an odd look on his face. Concern, perhaps? His eyes flitted quickly to Clint before he took his seat. "We will continue this session," the judge announced. But his voice was quieter now, almost cautious. Clint wasn't sure what was going on, but one thing was clear. This wasn't just about a trial anymore. The deeper Clint dug, the more he realized that the walls around him were closing in. And now, more than ever, he couldn't afford to back down. The game had changed. Clint could feel it. The game had shifted, and he was no longer just a bystander in his own trial. His words had sparked something in the room, but now, it was clear. He wasn't in control anymore. The pressure was mounting, and every move he made felt like it was being watched, weighed, and measured. The room felt suffocating. The eyes of the judge, prosecutor, and even the jury focused intently on him. Jessica returned to the table, her expression tense but determined. "I've got a few leads on the court clerk," she whispered quickly. "We might be able to push the judge into granting a delay for further investigation into your background." Clint nodded, his gaze shifting toward the judge, who was now carefully reviewing the papers in front of him. Clint could tell the judge was stalling, unsure of how to process the revelation of Clint's Secret Service credentials. He had never dealt with a situation like this before, and Clint knew the judge was being cautious, perhaps even scared. But Clint wasn't worried about the judge. The real danger was out there, beyond the walls of the courtroom. The criminals Clint had been chasing for months had now gotten wind of his involvement, and Clint wasn't sure if they were already making their next move. "Any word from Peter?" Clint asked Jessica as he watched the prosecutor, Michael Sanders, scribble something down on his legal pad, clearly thinking of his next attack. "No," she said, her voice low and cautious. "But something tells me he's got a plan. I don't trust Sanders. This is bigger than any case he's ever handled." Clint felt a pang of unease. Sanders wasn't just a typical prosecutor trying to win a case. The prosecutor's discomfort had been evident when Clint revealed his background, but there was something else lurking behind those well-practiced eyes, something far more dangerous. It was as if Sanders had already been pulled into the web of the criminal syndicate Clint was after, whether he knew it or not. The sound of the judge's gavel, hitting the desk, brought Clint's attention back to the present. "Mr. Eastwood," the judge said, his voice carefully measured, "this court will resume. I believe we are at a crossroads here. You've made serious claims, And while your actions today have raised more questions than answers, we are here to address the matter at hand. We will continue with the trial, but be advised, any further disruptions will not be tolerated. Clint's eyes narrowed. There it was. The warning. He had expected it, but it didn't change the fact that things were escalating fast. The trial, which had started as a minor issue over a car accident, was now a battleground with far higher stakes. It wasn't just Clint's future on the line anymore. There was a much larger game being played. Jessica stood beside Clint, her face a mask of professionalism, but Clint could sense the unease in her. She, too, understood the seriousness of the situation. "We'll play it your way," she said to the judge, her voice steady, but Clint could hear the underlying determination. She was ready for whatever came next. The prosecutor, Sanders, shifted his attention to Clint. "Let's get back to the matter at hand, Mr. Eastwood," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "If you insist on claiming this whole thing is a conspiracy, we'll need more than just your word. Show us the evidence. But until you do, we're going to focus on the real issue, your involvement in a minor traffic incident." Clint took a deep breath, choosing his next words carefully. This wasn't just about the accident anymore. It never had been. "The real issue," he said slowly, his voice cutting through the tension in the room, "is that you're not seeing the full picture. This accident? It wasn't an accident. It was planned. And it's part of a much larger scheme that I've been investigating for months." Sanders laughed derisively, but Clint could see the subtle shift in his body language. His shoulders stiffened, and his eyes flickered with uncertainty. "And what exactly are you suggesting, Eastwood? That this is some grand criminal conspiracy? That this simple traffic dispute has anything to do with your so-called investigation?" Clint didn't flinch. "I'm not suggesting anything. I'm telling you. This syndicate is targeting high-ranking officials. They don't care about small-time stuff. They want power. They want control. And right now, they've got people inside places you'd never expect." Clint could feel the weight of his words hanging in the air. The prosecutor didn't respond immediately, his gaze flicking back and forth between Clint and the judge. He was unsure, but Clint could see the gears turning. If Sanders wasn't part of the syndicate before, he certainly might be now. "Enough," the judge interjected, his voice louder now. "Mr. Eastwood, if you want this court to take your claims seriously, you will present the evidence, not just more speculation. I will not tolerate baseless accusations." Clint stood up, his eyes never leaving the judge's face. "I have the evidence," he said firmly, "but not here. Not now. If you want the truth, you'll have to listen when I'm ready to tell it. This goes far beyond the walls of this courtroom." The room went silent. Clint had just made a bold move, one that could either seal his fate or give him the leverage he desperately needed. Suddenly, the courtroom doors swung open, and in walked a familiar face, Peter. Clint's old friend from Hollywood, the man who had known him longer than anyone. But Peter wasn't alone. He had brought with him a man Clint recognized immediately, a former agent of the Secret Service. Clint's heart skipped a beat. What was going on? Had Peter gone off script? The judge raised an eyebrow, his suspicion clear. "Who are these people?" Peter stepped forward, a quiet confidence in his stride. "Your Honor, I have evidence that will help substantiate Mr. Eastwood's claims. It's information that cannot be ignored. You may want to listen." The entire room held its breath as the new turn of events unfolded before them. This was no longer about a car accident. It was about a much larger conspiracy. A conspiracy that had now moved from the shadows into the harsh light of this courtroom. And Clint knew the danger was only beginning. The judge's gavel slammed down with authority, signaling a momentary pause in the whirlwind that had become Clint Eastwood's courtroom battle. The entire room seemed to exhale collectively as Peter and the Secret Service agent stepped further into the space, carrying with them the weight of something far more serious than a traffic accident. Clint couldn't hide the mix of surprise and cautious optimism that flickered across his face. Peter's presence wasn't just unexpected. It was a sign that something was about to change. Whether that change would be for better or worse, Clint didn't know. But he had to trust that Peter was making the right call. Peter gave Clint a quick nod, then turned to address the judge. "Your Honor, I understand this may look unconventional, but what we have here is critical. Mr. Eastwood's claims of a widespread conspiracy aren't the ramblings of a man in distress. They're rooted in facts that go beyond this case. If you allow us to present this information, you will see that the implications stretch far beyond a simple car accident. The room went still. The words, widespread conspiracy, hung in the air like a thick fog, clouding everything. The judge's eyes narrowed, clearly skeptical. His hand hovered above his gavel, ready to strike down the proceedings if things went further off course. The prosecutor, Michael Sanders, stood up from his seat, his expression a mix of disbelief and growing suspicion. "Your Honor, this is absurd. We are here to settle a legal matter, nothing more. We do not have time for wild theories and distractions." Clint turned his head slowly toward Sanders, his voice calm but carrying the weight of his experience. "It's not a theory. It's a reality. You're in this deeper than you think, Sanders. We all are." The words were out before Clint could stop them. He couldn't help himself. He knew Sanders had been towing the line, perhaps unknowingly, for some time. Clint was ready to drag him into the mess if it meant unearthing the truth. Peter took a step forward, cutting through the mounting tension. "We don't need to speculate. What we have is real. If we are to make any progress, Your Honor, we must present this evidence now." The judge's fingers drummed lightly on the surface of his desk as he considered the request. His hesitation was clear. This wasn't just another case. It was a bombshell waiting to detonate. Finally, the judge sighed, rubbing his temples as if trying to stave off a headache. "I will allow it," he said reluctantly, "but make it quick. The courtroom will not tolerate endless delays." Peter nodded, and Clint felt a knot loosen in his stomach. This was it. The moment of truth. There would be no going back after this. Peter reached into his briefcase and pulled out a set of thick folders, each one marked with a series of cryptic labels. He handed them to the judge, who accepted them with evident curiosity. "These," Peter began, "are files that were recovered from sources inside government agencies. What's in them is highly classified, but it's essential for understanding the full extent of what Mr. Eastwood has been investigating. These files trace the involvement of key players in a global operation, an operation that uses seemingly unrelated incidents, like the car accident in question, as a cover for their true activities." The judge opened one of the folders, his eyes scanning the contents. His face remained impassive, but Clint noticed the subtle shift in his demeanor. The judge's posture became straighter, more focused. He was no longer dismissing Clint's claims. Something was shifting. "What exactly are we looking at here?" the judge asked, though his voice was more measured now. Peter stepped closer. "What you're holding, Your Honor, is evidence of a long-standing criminal syndicate that has managed to infiltrate government agencies at multiple levels. The accident that occurred was just one piece of a much larger puzzle. These files contain connections between high-ranking officials and illegal activities tied to organized crime, espionage, and covert operations." A ripple of disbelief swept through the courtroom. The prosecutor, Michael Sanders, took a step back, his eyes darting around the room. The jury was visibly stunned. Even Jessica, who had been Clint's rock throughout this ordeal, was now wide-eyed with the enormity of what was unfolding. The judge looked up, his face pale, his mouth slightly ajar. "Are you suggesting that government officials are involved in this?" Peter nodded solemnly. "Not just involved. They're complicit. The extent of their involvement, Your Honor, goes all the way to the top. And the accident, this case, is merely the tip of the iceberg. These individuals orchestrate everything, from seemingly innocent public events to the destruction of evidence, all with the aim of controlling the flow of information and maintaining their power." Clint could see the judge's hands trembling slightly as he flipped through the files. The weight of the situation was sinking in. He could feel the walls closing in around them. This wasn't just about Clint's reputation anymore. It was about national security, corruption, and the lives of countless innocent people. Jessica leaned in close to Clint, her voice barely above a whisper. "Clint, this is huge. Do you really think this is all connected to the accident?" Clint's jaw tightened. "It's not just about the accident, Jess. It's about everything. All of it. They wanted me silenced. They wanted to make sure that I didn't find out what was really going on behind the scenes. This trial? It's part of their cover-up." Suddenly, The courtroom door opened once more, and another figure entered. A man in a dark suit who appeared to be in his early 50s. His expression was unreadable, but the way he walked, shoulders squared, exuded confidence, and there was something about him that Clint immediately recognized. This wasn't just any random person entering the room. This man had the presence of someone who held power. The judge didn't even look up. "I didn't ask for another interruption," he snapped. But the man approached the bench without hesitation, his eyes never leaving Clint. "I think you'll want to hear what I have to say, Your Honor." Clint's stomach churned. Who was this person? What did he know? And why did he look so damn familiar? The man paused for a moment before speaking again, his voice smooth but laced with something far more dangerous. "You're all chasing the wrong ghosts. The people you think are the threat? They're just pawns. The real power is held by those in the shadows." A cold shiver ran down Clint's spine. He knew then, without a doubt, that this man was tied to the very conspiracy he had been investigating. The judge, clearly confused but intrigued, glanced at the man. "Who are you?" "I'm someone who can help you understand the truth," the man replied, his eyes never leaving Clint's. "But you're going to have to trust me." Clint's heart raced as the pieces began to fall into place. The more he uncovered, the more he realized just how deep this went. And now, with this man in the room, the stakes were higher than ever. The courtroom was now teetering on the edge of chaos. The arrival of the mysterious man had sent a jolt of tension through the room, and Clint could feel the temperature in the air drop as he exchanged an uncertain glance with Jessica. The man's presence was electric, charged with a palpable danger that seemed to ripple through the space. The judge, having gathered himself, fixed the man with a wary gaze. "Who are you?" he asked again, his voice firmer this time. The man smiled slightly, though it didn't reach his eyes. "My name is Adrian Cole, and what I have to say could change everything for this trial, and for Mr. Eastwood's future." Clint felt a chill run down his spine. Adrian Cole. He had heard that name before, and not in the context of anything good. Adrian was known in certain circles, a man whose name was whispered in the shadows, linked to the very conspiracy Clint had been fighting against for months. The judge hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the unexpected arrival of this new player. "I don't know who you are or what your connection is to this case, but this is a court of law. We do not entertain mystery men walking in with last-minute evidence." Adrian didn't flinch. "I'm not here to entertain you, Your Honor. I'm here to offer you the truth, whether you're ready for it or not." Clint studied Adrian closely, his mind racing. The man exuded an air of power, calm, confident, and utterly unshaken. But Clint wasn't fooled. Adrian had a hand in the shadows, pulling strings from behind the scenes. He was one of them, one of the people Clint had been chasing, and if he was here now, it could only mean one thing. The stakes had just gone through the roof. "Mr. Eastwood," the judge said, breaking Clint's reverie, "I suggest you explain to the court what this is all about. I'm giving you a moment, but this better be relevant to the case at hand." Clint swallowed hard, his heart thundering in his chest. The time had come to reveal the truth. But the truth was complicated. So much more than he could possibly put into words. He glanced at Jessica, who gave him an encouraging nod, before turning his attention back to Adrian. Adrian took a step forward, his eyes scanning the room with cold precision. He addressed the judge, but his words were for everyone. "What you don't understand, Your Honor, is that you're all just pieces on a very large chessboard. The car accident, this trial, it's all a smokescreen. This court, the people sitting in this room, the very fabric of what you believe to be justice, it's all been manipulated. And if you don't open your eyes to what's really going on, you'll be just another casualty in a much bigger war." Clint's grip on the edge of the table tightened. Adrian wasn't talking in circles. He was saying exactly what Clint had suspected but had never been able to prove, until now. The prosecutor, Sanders, scoffed, but Clint saw the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. "This is absurd. Are we seriously listening to this man? He sounds like a conspiracy theorist." "Call it what you want," Adrian replied coolly, "but I'm not the one sitting in this courtroom playing games. I'm here to offer you a choice. Listen to me now, and you might just avoid becoming a casualty yourself." Jessica's eyes widened. "Clint, she whispered urgently. This is the man. He's one of the key players in this whole thing. Clint nodded, already piecing things together. If Adrian Cole was here, it meant he was tied directly to the criminal syndicate Clint had been investigating. This was no longer just a trial. It was a standoff between Clint, the powers he was trying to bring down, and a force much larger than he had ever imagined. The judge, despite his initial reluctance, seemed to be listening. He glanced from Adrian to Clint, his gaze narrowing. Mr. Eastwood, I think you should explain yourself. What is the connection between this man and the case at hand? Clint took a deep breath, his heart pounding in his chest. This was his chance to not only defend himself, but also to expose everything. To stop the conspiracy dead in its tracks. Adrian Cole, Clint began, his voice steady but filled with purpose, isn't just some man with a vendetta. He's been pulling the strings from behind the scenes for months, perhaps even longer. He's a part of the syndicate I've been investigating, the one that's been orchestrating these so-called accidents, manipulating the system, and destroying lives. The room seemed to collectively hold its breath. The weight of Clint's words settled over the court like a thick fog. Adrian didn't flinch. He simply raised an eyebrow, his expression one of amusement. You have no idea who you're up against, Mr. Eastwood. The very system you're trying to expose is the one you've been running in for years. You've been chasing ghosts, powerful ones, and now they've come for you. Clint's jaw clenched. Adrian's words were a threat, but Clint knew that it was too late to back down now. If he didn't confront this head-on, he would lose everything. His career, his reputation, and perhaps even his life. This was no longer just about clearing his name in a courtroom. It was about survival. What exactly do you want, Adrian? Clint asked, his voice cold but firm. Why are you here? To intimidate me? Or do you actually have something to offer? Adrian's smile was thin, almost predatory. I'm here to offer you a choice, Mr. Eastwood. You can continue this crusade of yours and face certain destruction, or you can join us. We can help you, show you how things really work. The power, the control, it's all within your reach. But you have to be willing to see things for what they truly are. Clint's blood ran cold. And what exactly is that? The world isn't black and white, Clint, Adrian replied softly. It's gray. You can be part of the system, or you can be crushed by it. The choice is yours. The words hung in the air, heavy and laden with threat. The prosecutor, Sanders, stood frozen, unsure of how to respond to the sudden turn of events. The judge was silent, his face a mask of confusion and uncertainty. Jessica leaned toward Clint, her whisper urgent. Clint, don't listen to him. He's trying to buy you off. We can take him down. You just need to stay focused. Clint's mind raced. Adrian was offering him power, influence, a chance to be part of the very machine he had spent years fighting against. But Clint knew that accepting that offer would mean losing everything he stood for. His integrity, his values. It would all be sacrificed for a taste of power that he could never trust. He turned his gaze back to Adrian, his resolve hardening. I'm not going to play your game, Adrian. I'll expose you and everyone like you, no matter the cost. Adrian's smile faded, replaced by an expression of dark amusement. You're making a mistake, Clint, but you'll learn the hard way. They always do. The tension in the room was suffocating as Adrian turned to leave, but before he could exit, the door slammed open again, and another figure entered the courtroom. This time, it was someone Clint had never expected. Peter. But this time, Peter wasn't alone. He had brought with him something that would change everything. Clint's eyes widened in disbelief as Peter entered the courtroom, flanked by two other figures. The air shifted, thick with anticipation. This wasn't just an ordinary surprise. This was a move in the game. Peter had brought backup, and that could only mean one thing. The stakes had been raised yet again. The two figures with Peter weren't just any lawyers or assistants. No, they were special agents. Their suits were immaculate, but their presence in the room sent an unmistakable signal. This was no longer just a courtroom drama. It was a battle between powers far beyond the legal system. These agents, Clint realized, had been working behind the scenes for a long time, and they were here to ensure that justice would not be a casualty. The judge, clearly startled by the entrance, tried to maintain order. What is this? Another interruption? Peter, never one to waste time, stepped forward confidently. Your Honor, what you're about to hear is something far more critical than this case. This isn't just about Clint Eastwood. This is about something far bigger. This is about national security. The entire room went dead silent. The judge froze, his gavel now motionless in his hand. Michael Sanders, the prosecutor, looked as if he might faint. The jury shifted uncomfortably, sensing that they were standing at the edge of something monumental. Jessica, standing beside Clint, took a sharp breath, her hand lightly touching his arm, as if anchoring him in the present moment. "What are you talking about, Peter?" the judge finally asked, his voice a mix of disbelief and growing concern. "National security? Are you seriously suggesting that we're dealing with something of that magnitude here?" Peter glanced at Clint, a look of determination passing between them. Then, he nodded toward the two special agents behind him, signaling that they were ready to move forward. "Mr. Eastwood," Peter began, his tone low and serious, "has been involved in a much larger operation than anyone here could have anticipated. What's at stake isn't just his reputation. It's the stability of our country. The accident, the trial, it's all part of a much larger conspiracy, one that involves the highest levels of government, corporate espionage, and covert operations that threaten the very foundations of our democracy." Clint could hear the disbelief in the room, but the gravity of Peter's words was undeniable. He wasn't just talking about corporate corruption or shady dealings in the background. He was talking about something that could change the course of history. The agents, who had remained silent until now, stepped forward. One of them, a woman with sharp features and a no-nonsense expression, handed the judge a sealed envelope. The envelope was official, bearing a stamp that no one in the courtroom could mistake for anything other than the seal of the highest authority. The judge, his curiosity piqued, opened the envelope carefully and began reading the contents. As he did, the air seemed to grow thicker, and Clint could feel the tension building. This was it, the moment when everything could either come crashing down or finally begin to make sense. I don't believe this," the judge muttered under his breath. His eyes flickered between the agents and Peter, disbelief and shock on his face. Clint's mind raced. What had been written in that document? Was it finally the proof they needed? Or had they just opened a Pandora's box that couldn't be closed? After what felt like an eternity, the judge cleared his throat. "Mr. Eastwood, Peter, what is this? What am I looking at?" Peter took a deep breath before speaking. "This, Your Honor, is evidence of the coordinated efforts between the individuals involved in this conspiracy, individuals who have been manipulating both the private and public sectors for years." Clint's investigation was never just about him. He stumbled upon something much bigger than a simple cover-up. What he's been uncovering is part of a massive global operation involving corruption, power, and influence, spanning governments, corporations, and more. Clint's heart raced as he tried to make sense of what was happening. Adrian Cole's warning echoed in his mind. "You're making a mistake, Clint, but you'll learn the hard way. They always do." Was this all part of the game? Was he being played from the beginning? "Are you suggesting that Mr. Eastwood's accident was part of a larger plot?" the judge asked, his voice shaky as he stared at the agents. "That this entire trial, this case, is nothing more than a cover?" Peter nodded solemnly. "Yes, Your Honor. The car accident that started all of this was no accident at all. It was engineered to silence Clint and discredit his investigation. They knew he was getting too close to the truth, so they tried to take him out. But Clint survived. And now, the people responsible are doing everything they can to make sure he never exposes them." Clint took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. This was the moment of truth, the moment where everything either fell apart or came together. "I've been targeted by powerful people, people who have the resources to make anyone disappear. But I refuse to let them win. Not when so much is at stake." The prosecutor, Michael Sanders, stood frozen in disbelief. "You're saying we've all been duped? That this whole trial has been a farce?" Peter turned toward Sanders, his gaze hard. "Yes, that's exactly what we're saying. You're all part of a system that has been compromised. But now it's time to clean house." The tension in the room reached a boiling point. The jury was completely silent, each member caught in a whirlwind of emotions: disbelief, confusion, and fear. Jessica stepped closer to Clint, her hand gripping his arm tightly, as if to remind him that he wasn't alone in this fight. As the courtroom fell into a stunned silence, one of the special agents, the man with a stern face, stepped forward and addressed the judge directly. "Your Honor," the agent said in a gravelly voice, "we have already begun dismantling the network involved in this operation. But the fight isn't over. Not by a long shot. There are people with immense power who will stop at nothing to protect their interests. We need to act quickly and decisively if we're going to expose this conspiracy before it's too late." The judge nodded slowly, clearly shaken. "And what exactly do you want from me?" "We need your cooperation," the agent replied. "We need this court to officially halt the trial and allow us to continue our investigation. We cannot afford to let this case continue as it stands. The longer we wait, the more lives are at risk." Clint felt a surge of hope, but it was quickly tempered by the reality of what they were up against. He knew that this was just the beginning. The conspiracy was massive, and the forces arrayed against them were powerful and ruthless. But they had something that the enemy didn't: the truth. Clint looked at Jessica, his resolve hardening. "We're not backing down now. Not after everything we've uncovered." The judge glanced down at the evidence, then back up at Clint. His eyes were tired but resolute. "I'm going to call a recess," he said quietly. "We need time to process everything we've heard today. But make no mistake, this case is far from over." As the gavel slammed down, Clint knew that the game had changed. They weren't just playing by the rules anymore. They were rewriting the game entirely. Clint couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The courtroom had emptied out, but something lingered in the air. The stakes had been raised, but Clint knew this was just the beginning. Adrian Cole's cryptic warning echoed in his mind. They always learn the hard way. Outside the courthouse, the sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the steps. Clint stood near the exit, surrounded by his team: Peter, Jessica, and the two special agents who had arrived with the unexpected revelation. The agents, Agent Pierce and Agent Lawrence, looked every bit as formidable as their reputation suggested. They stood a little apart from the others, their eyes scanning the surroundings, alert for any signs of danger. "We've made a powerful enemy, Clint," Peter said, his voice low. "We need to move quickly. There's no telling how far-reaching their influence goes, but after what we revealed in there, I have no doubt that they'll try to silence us." Clint nodded grimly. No going back now. The conspiracy was deeper than he had imagined, and the battle had shifted from a personal vendetta to a high-stakes war. Every decision mattered, every move counted. Jessica placed a hand on Clint's shoulder, her gaze firm. "We'll get through this. You're not alone in this fight. We have the truth on our side." Her words, though comforting, couldn't ease the weight pressing down on Clint's chest. The truth, he realized, was both a weapon and a target. The higher they climbed, the more dangerous it became. They were entering territory where the rules no longer applied, and where the very institutions they thought they could trust had been compromised. Just then, Agent Pierce approached Clint, his expression unreadable. "We've been tracking some of the people involved in this operation for months. What we've learned is that they've anticipated moves like yours. They've had eyes on you for a long time, Clint, and they won't stop until they've either destroyed you or bought you off." Clint stiffened, instinctively looking around. The bustling street outside seemed peaceful enough, but Pierce's warning hit like a ton of bricks. "They've had eyes on me?" Clint repeated, trying to keep his voice steady. "Since when?" Pierce didn't flinch. "Since the beginning. We were aware of your investigation before you even knew what you were up against. This is bigger than anything you've seen." Jessica frowned, her concern palpable. "What exactly are we dealing with here, Agent Pierce? How deep does this go?" The agent paused for a moment, then motioned for the group to move down the street, away from prying ears. Once they were a little more isolated, Pierce spoke again. "What we're up against is a clandestine operation, global in scale. It involves corrupt individuals in key government positions, multinational corporations, and various shadow organizations. They manipulate everything: politics, finance, the media, all to keep control. Their influence extends far beyond just the United States. This is a power structure that's been operating in the shadows for decades. Clint swallowed hard, the gravity of the situation sinking in. He'd known things were bad, but hearing it laid out like this made it all too real. This wasn't just a conspiracy. It was a machine that had infiltrated nearly every layer of society. Are we talking about an actual cabal? Clint asked, his voice a mixture of disbelief and anger. A group that's been pulling the strings behind the scenes? Exactly, Pierce confirmed. And they're good at what they do. Very good. They've made sure no one can reach them, no one can expose them. Until now. Clint felt his fists clench at his sides. So this trial, this accident, it was all just part of their plan to shut me down? Pierce nodded gravely. Yes. They've been tracking you, Clint. Your investigation into the accident wasn't an isolated incident. It was the first step in uncovering their operation. They don't like that. They want you gone, or at the very least, irrelevant. Jessica shot Clint a glance. What now? What do we do? Do we have a way to take them down? Pierce didn't answer immediately. Instead, he took out a small device, a tablet, and handed it to Clint. On the screen was a map of the United States, dotted with various locations. Some were cities, others were specific addresses. Clint's heart skipped a beat. What's this? He asked. Targets, Pierce said simply. Locations where we've identified key players involved in this conspiracy. If we can get to them, we might be able to unravel this whole thing. But be warned, Clint. Getting close to these people will be dangerous. They have eyes everywhere. Clint studied the map, his mind whirring. The list of names on the device was chilling. High-profile individuals, corporations, and other figures who had far more power than Clint had initially realized. It was a who's who of the corrupt and the influential. But there were also other names, individuals whose connection to the conspiracy was still unclear. So we go after them? Clint asked, his resolve hardening. We start picking them off one by one? We need to be smart, Pierce cautioned. We can't just rush in guns blazing. We need intel. We need leverage. We need to outsmart them, not just fight them head-on. Jessica nodded in agreement. This won't be easy, but it's the only way. Clint's mind flashed back to the earlier moments in the courtroom, to Adrian Cole's smug face and his cryptic words. The conspiracy was still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. If Clint wasn't careful, he could be walking straight into a trap. But this time, Clint was ready. He wasn't going to back down. He had the truth on his side, and he wasn't about to let these people win. We start tomorrow, Clint said, his voice unwavering. We take this to them. We expose them for who they really are. And we take them down. Peter looked at Clint, a flicker of admiration in his eyes. You're not backing down, are you? Clint's lips curled into a tight smile. Not now. Not ever. As the group walked away from the courthouse, Clint could feel the weight of what lay ahead pressing down on him. This wasn't just a battle for his reputation. It was a fight for everything. The truth. The system. Justice. But even as he steeled himself for what was to come, he knew that the fight had just begun. The enemy was closer than ever, and every step forward would be a step deeper into the shadows. But Clint Eastwood had never been one to shy away from the dark. He was ready. The next few days felt like a whirlwind. Clint, Jessica, Peter, and the two special agents, Pierce and Lawrence, met in a small, discreet location to strategize. The stakes had never been higher. What had begun as a seemingly straightforward trial had morphed into something far darker, far more dangerous. The map Pierce had handed Clint showed key locations where they could target members of the conspiracy. Each location on the map was marked with a name, a company, or a government figure. Some were just names on a list, but others were far more dangerous, their reach extending into high levels of power. You understand that going after them won't be easy, right? Pierce said as they huddled around the table, his finger tracing one of the locations on the map, a luxury penthouse in New York City. These people aren't just corrupt businessmen or shady politicians. These are people with resources, powerful people. They've got private security, they've got connections in law enforcement, and they'll stop at nothing to protect their interests. Clint didn't flinch. He had been in dangerous situations before, but this felt different. There was a weight in the air, a sense of inevitability. They were up against an invisible enemy, one that had infiltrated every corner of society, and they had no idea who they could trust anymore. "So what's the first move?" Jessica asked, her tone focused. Pierce leaned back in his chair, studying the map. "We need to go after the low-hanging fruit first. The ones who are easier to get to. The smaller players who can lead us to the bigger ones. But we have to be careful. Every step has to be calculated. If we make a wrong move, we could alert them, and then we'll lose our chance." Clint nodded. It was a strategy that made sense. They had to work methodically, pick off the smaller players, and build up their case. But Clint wasn't just in this for information. He wanted justice. He wanted to expose these people for the monsters they were, and he didn't care how dangerous the path ahead would be. "We're ready," Clint said, his voice steady. "Let's get started." The plan was simple, but the execution would be anything but. They would start with one of the smaller figures on the list, a man named Richard Hardwick. He was an executive at a defense contractor, one of the companies that had been involved in covert operations overseas. Hardwick was known to have connections with several key politicians, but he wasn't exactly a high-profile target yet. But Clint knew that targeting Hardwick could give them the leverage they needed. They could use him to get closer to the people who were really pulling the strings. The plan was to confront Hardwick, gather evidence, and get him to cooperate. But Clint knew they couldn't trust anyone, especially not someone like Hardwick, who would likely do whatever it took to save himself. It was a dangerous game. One wrong move, and the whole operation could implode. The team gathered their gear, preparing for the operation. The mood was tense, but Clint felt the adrenaline coursing through his veins. This was what he had been training for, what he had been preparing for all his life. This wasn't just about taking down one man. It was about exposing an entire system. As they made their way toward Hardwick's penthouse in the heart of Manhattan, Clint's mind raced. Was this really the first step toward bringing down the conspiracy? Or were they walking straight into a trap? The car pulled up to a sleek, modern building, its glass windows reflecting the early evening sky. Clint felt a pang of uncertainty as they entered the lobby. Hardwick was inside somewhere, but how could they be sure of anything? How could they be sure that Hardwick wasn't already on their trail? "Stick to the plan," Pierce said quietly, his voice cutting through Clint's thoughts. "We get in, we get the evidence, and we get out. No heroics." Clint nodded, his pulse quickening. This wasn't about heroics. It was about survival. The plan was solid, but there were always variables, things that couldn't be predicted. Hardwick's security, his connections. Who knew how deep this went? They took the elevator up to the penthouse level, the tension thickening as the floors passed by. Each floor felt like a countdown to something. Clint's mind kept replaying everything that had led them to this moment. The accident, the trial, the secrets, the lies. This wasn't just a fight for justice. It was a fight for the truth itself. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime, and they stepped into a luxurious hallway. Hardwick's penthouse was at the end of the corridor, the double doors standing tall like the entrance to a fortress. But Clint didn't feel intimidated. If anything, he was more determined than ever. Pierce motioned for the group to move forward, and they approached the door. It was time. As they reached for the doorbell, Clint couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. He turned slightly, scanning the hallway. For a split second, he thought he saw a shadow move in the corner of his vision. "Something's not right," Clint murmured. But before anyone could respond, the doors swung open. Standing in front of them was Richard Hardwick himself, his sharp features framed by the doorway. He looked surprised, but not terrified. There was something unsettling about the calmness in his eyes. "Mr. Eastwood," Hardwick said, his voice smooth and cold. "I've been expecting you." Clint's stomach dropped. The plan had just shifted. Hardwick wasn't surprised because of a coincidence. He was expecting them. "We need to talk," Clint said, keeping his tone steady. "About everything." Hardwick didn't move. He didn't need to. "I think you already know what's at stake, Clint. And you know that you're not the first person to come knocking. But I have to warn you, this isn't a game. You're stepping into something much bigger than you realize." Clint's heart pounded. This was it. The moment where everything changed. "Then you'll know that I'm not backing down," Clint said, his voice firm. This ends now. Hardwick stepped aside and motioned for them to enter. We'll see about that. As Clint crossed the threshold into the penthouse, he knew that this was no longer just about uncovering the truth. It was about surviving the game that had been set in motion long before he even realized it. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? The door clicked shut behind Clint and his team, and for a moment, the silence inside the penthouse felt suffocating. The luxurious surroundings of Richard Hardwick's home seemed to mock the danger Clint could feel building in his gut. The room was filled with sleek, modern furniture, towering windows that offered a breathtaking view of the Manhattan skyline, and enough opulence to make a person dizzy. Hardwick, standing by the door with an unreadable smile on his face, gestured for Clint and the team to take a seat. "Please, make yourselves comfortable," Hardwick said, his voice almost too smooth. "I believe we have a lot to discuss." Clint exchanged a glance with Jessica, Peter, and the two agents. Every instinct in him screamed that something was wrong, but they had no choice but to press forward. This was the lead they needed, and there was no turning back now. Pierce and Lawrence flanked the room's perimeter, their eyes darting between the doors and the windows, alert for any sign of trouble. Jessica moved to the couch, sitting slightly forward, ready for anything. Hardwick, meanwhile, settled into an armchair across from Clint, his legs crossed, his fingers steepled in front of him as if he were about to deliver a lecture. "I'm sure you have questions," Hardwick began, breaking the silence that had settled like a heavy fog. "But before we get to that, let me make one thing clear. I don't want to waste your time, Clint. You've already made a name for yourself, and I respect that." Clint leaned forward, careful to mask the wariness building in his chest. "I'm not here for your respect, Hardwick. I'm here for the truth, and I'm going to find it, whether you help me or not." Hardwick chuckled, almost like he was enjoying a private joke. "I was hoping you'd say that. The truth, it's a dangerous thing, don't you think? Especially when you're not prepared for it." The hairs on the back of Clint's neck stood on end. That was the last thing he wanted to hear. Every word Hardwick spoke sounded carefully calculated, like a chess player preparing for a checkmate. Clint had walked into a lion's den, and now he needed to stay one step ahead. "We both know you're more than just a businessman, Hardwick," Clint pressed, his voice growing firmer. "We know what you're involved in. The operations overseas, the corruption. Don't pretend like it's just business as usual." Hardwick's smile didn't falter. He remained calm, almost annoyingly composed. "I never said it was just business. But you have to understand, Clint, this isn't personal. Not for me, anyway." Clint's eyes narrowed. "Then why am I here?" Hardwick finally stood up, his tall frame casting a shadow over Clint. He walked over to the window and gazed out at the skyline, his back turned to the group. "Because you're in the middle of something that's much bigger than you or me. You've opened a door, Clint. And once that door is open, there's no shutting it again. You want to take down powerful people? Fine. But know this, it's not just your life at risk anymore." Clint's heart skipped a beat, and he exchanged a brief, uneasy glance with Jessica. Hardwick wasn't just talking about the conspiracy anymore. He was talking about them. "Are you threatening me?" Clint's voice was colder now, sharper. Hardwick turned around slowly, his expression still unreadable. "No, I'm warning you. There's no going back, Clint. You may think you're fighting for justice, but what you're really doing is playing into a much larger game. A game that has been going on long before you stepped into the courtroom." Clint felt a flicker of doubt gnaw at him, but he pushed it aside. He couldn't afford to show weakness now. "We don't need your warnings," Pierce said, his voice firm. "We're here for evidence, for answers. Either you give us what we want, or this will go much further than you expect." Hardwick raised an eyebrow, clearly unfazed. "You think I'm going to give you what you want that easily? You're not the first to come knocking on my door, and you won't be the last." Clint's mind raced. There was something deeper going on here, something that Hardwick wasn't saying. "We're not leaving without answers," Clint said, determination cutting through the uncertainty. "So you can either cooperate now, or we can go public. You know we have the means to expose you." Hardwick tilted his head, as if considering Clint's words. Then, A cold smile spread across his face. You think you have leverage? You think you're in control of this situation? Clint took a slow breath, trying to maintain his composure. Every second that passed felt like the walls were closing in. I don't think we're in control, Clint said. But we will be. That was the moment everything changed. Suddenly, the calm of the room was shattered by the sharp sound of a door opening from the back of the penthouse. Hardwick's smile vanished, replaced with something Clint could only describe as unease. From the shadows emerged a figure, stepping into the room with an air of authority. Clint's heart raced as the figure came closer, a tall, well-dressed man in a sharp black suit, his face obscured by a pair of dark sunglasses. He didn't say a word, but his presence was undeniable. Hardwick looked at him, his face tightening, and then back at Clint. "Now, Clint," Hardwick said, his voice now cold and threatening, "you've met someone who can make things much more difficult for you." Clint's instincts kicked in, and before he could react, the man in sunglasses pulled something from his coat, a badge. He held it up for Clint to see. The letters USSS were engraved at the top. Clint's breath caught in his throat. The United States Secret Service? The badge flashed briefly, then disappeared back into the man's jacket, as if to emphasize the power that came with it. "You should have known," the man said, his voice low, his words deliberate. "You're way over your head now, Clint Eastwood." Clint's pulse quickened, his mind racing. This wasn't just about Hardwick anymore. It was about the very forces that had been manipulating things behind the scenes. It was about the system that had been corrupted beyond recognition. Hardwick, sensing Clint's shock, smirked. "You're right. It's not just business. It's personal. And you've made a very dangerous enemy today." The room seemed to close in around Clint as the man in the sunglasses slowly approached him. The weight of the USSS badge still lingered in the air like a suffocating cloud. Clint's heart pounded in his chest as his mind scrambled to process what was happening. The presence of the Secret Service, a branch that normally dealt with the protection of the nation's highest officials, meant that the stakes had just been raised to an unimaginable level. "Do you know what you're up against?" The man's voice was low, deliberate, and laced with a quiet menace. He wasn't asking a question. He was making a statement. "You've been playing in a world you don't understand, Clint. You've walked straight into the lion's den, and there's no way out now." Clint stood his ground, not allowing the fear gnawing at him to show on his face. He had seen dangerous situations before, but this felt different. The man in front of him wasn't just a goon or a corporate pawn. He was someone who had power, real power, and Clint could sense that every second he spent in that room made him a target. "What's your name?" Clint asked, his voice steady despite the rising tension. The man didn't respond immediately. Instead, he gave Clint a long, piercing look, as if sizing him up. It was unnerving, and Clint could feel the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. "You don't need to know my name," the man finally said, his voice cold. "What you need to understand is that the game you've decided to play is one that you can't win." Hardwick, still standing near the window, smiled at Clint's discomfort. "You see, Clint," he said, his voice almost patronizing, "this is where your little crusade ends. You're fighting against a system that has been in place for decades. You're just one man. And now, you've made an enemy of the very people who control the system." Clint's mind raced, but he refused to show weakness. He had come this far, and he wasn't about to back down now. "I've been up against bigger enemies than you, Hardwick, and I've taken them down. This isn't over." The man in sunglasses let out a small, almost pitying chuckle. "You think you've been fighting the enemy? Clint, the enemy is not a person. It's an entire system, a machine that operates from the shadows. And no matter how hard you fight, no matter how many pieces of evidence you collect, you'll never be able to expose it for what it truly is." Clint's mind churned. He knew the man was right about one thing. The system was vast, powerful, and deeply embedded in every facet of society. But that didn't mean it was invincible. "You're wrong," Clint said, his voice firmer now. "The system can be exposed. It can be broken. And I'm the one who's going to do it." Hardwick's smile faded, replaced by a cold, calculating look. "You're naive, Clint. You think this is about right and wrong. It's not. It's about power, and power always wins. Clint couldn't deny the truth in Hardwick's words, but that didn't mean he was ready to give up. He had fought too hard to back down now. Power might win, but truth will always come to light. And when it does, it'll bring this whole thing crashing down. The man in sunglasses took a step forward, his expression hardening. You're wasting your time, Clint. You don't even know who you're really up against. But don't worry. You will soon enough. Hardwick turned toward the door. Take him, he said flatly, his voice cold. Before Clint could react, two men in black suits stepped into the room, moving with surprising speed and precision. They reached for Clint, but he was ready. His training kicked in, and he swiftly sidestepped the first man's grab. In one fluid motion, Clint twisted the second man's arm behind his back and slammed him into the nearby wall. The man grunted in pain, but Clint didn't hesitate. He knew this was a warning. Hardwick and his associates weren't playing around. They were sending a message. Let's not make this worse than it needs to be, Clint said, his voice calm but filled with determination. He had been through too much to let fear control him now. The man in sunglasses looked on without expression, then nodded slightly to the other men, signaling them to back off. They hesitated, but obeyed. Impressive, Hardwick said, his voice tinged with something like admiration, but his eyes were still cold. But it doesn't matter. You'll never win this. You're out of your depth, Clint, and soon you'll realize just how far you've fallen. Clint kept his posture strong, refusing to show any sign of weakness. I'm not here to win. I'm here to expose the truth, and you're going to help me do that. Hardwick laughed, but it was hollow, a sound that barely covered the fear Clint had just sparked in him. You think I'll help you? You're in no position to demand anything. But if you want to continue down this path, be my guest. Just know that every move you make, every step you take, will bring you closer to a point of no return. Clint wasn't done yet. He wasn't leaving until he had the information he needed, no matter how hard they tried to intimidate him. I'll get what I came for, Clint said, his words sharp, whether you help me or not. For a moment, it looked like Hardwick might snap, but instead, he gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. Very well, Hardwick said, his voice colder than ever. You'll have your answers, but be careful what you wish for. Clint turned to leave, but as he did, the man in sunglasses stepped forward again. Just remember, Clint, the man said, his voice low and dangerous. The moment you step out that door, you'll never be the same. You won't even recognize your own reflection. The game you've entered is unforgiving, and soon, you'll wish you never opened this door. Clint didn't respond. Instead, he turned and walked toward the door, but a feeling of unease washed over him. Something was happening, something bigger than he had anticipated, and he was getting closer to uncovering the truth, no matter the cost. The door slammed shut behind him, and as Clint stepped into the night air, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was walking deeper into the heart of darkness. But one thing was certain, there was no going back now. The cold night air hit Clint's face as soon as the penthouse door slammed shut behind him, and for a moment he paused, standing on the quiet street outside. He could feel the weight of what had just transpired settling heavily in his chest. Everything he thought he knew about the case, about Hardwick, had just been turned upside down. It wasn't just about a corrupt businessman anymore. It was about something far bigger, something connected to powerful, hidden forces. Jessica, Peter, and the others were already outside, waiting by the cars, their faces tense with concern. Clint didn't waste time. He walked toward them, his eyes scanning the street for any signs of danger. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that someone was following their every move. Clint, Jessica said, her voice low but urgent. What happened in there? Clint didn't answer right away. Instead, he took a deep breath, feeling the cold air burn his lungs. He couldn't afford to let his emotions get the better of him now, not when they were so close. They're on to us, Clint finally said, his voice grim. Hardwick isn't just some criminal. He's connected to something much bigger. The man with the USSS badge, he's part of it. Peter's eyes widened in disbelief. The Secret Service? What does that mean? Are they involved in this whole mess? Clint ran a hand through his hair, trying to shake off the frustration gnawing at him. I don't know yet, but I do know this. It's not just about corruption or dirty deals. They're playing a much bigger game, one that's hidden behind layers of power and influence. Jessica nodded, her expression hardening. So what's the next move? How do we even begin to unravel something this deep? Clint looked around, his mind racing. He felt like a pawn in a game he didn't fully understand, but he wasn't about to back down. They had to keep pushing forward, even if it meant walking through a storm of uncertainty. We need to find out who's behind this, Clint said, his voice steady with resolve. Whoever these people are, they're controlling everything from the shadows. If we can expose them, we can bring it all crashing down. Peter looked concerned. But how do we do that without becoming targets ourselves? Clint hesitated. The truth was, they were already targets. And the deeper they went, the more dangerous it would get. But Clint wasn't afraid of danger. Not anymore. I don't know yet, Clint admitted. But we've got no choice but to keep going. We're not just fighting for justice, we're fighting for survival. With that, Clint led the group to their cars, his mind already turning over the next step in the plan. They needed to go underground for a while, lay low, and gather as much intel as they could. The connections Hardwick had were too far-reaching for them to tackle head-on just yet. As they drove through the darkened streets of New York, Clint's thoughts kept returning to the man with the USSS badge. Who was he really? Was he just a pawn like Clint, or was he one of the masterminds behind the entire operation? The answers were out there, and Clint was going to find them, no matter the cost. By the time they arrived at a small, discreet safe house in Brooklyn, Clint was on edge. The weight of the situation hung over him like a storm cloud, and the oppressive silence of the night only amplified his anxiety. They had to be careful now. Every move, every decision, had to be calculated. One wrong step, and they could end up dead or worse. Silence before they could uncover the truth. Inside the safe house, the group gathered around a table, maps and documents spread out before them. Clint paced as he ran over the events of the night in his mind. Hardwick, the USSS agent, the warning they had received. It was all connected somehow, but the pieces weren't fitting together just yet. Clint, Jessica spoke up, breaking his thoughts. We need to figure out who these people are. We can't just keep reacting. We need to be proactive. Clint stopped pacing and looked at her, his mind shifting gears. You're right. We need to find out who's pulling the strings, who Hardwick is working for. Peter leaned forward, his brow furrowing. What about the files we took from Hardwick's office? Maybe there's something in there that'll help. Clint nodded, feeling a flicker of hope. It had been risky, grabbing those files while they were still in Hardwick's penthouse, but if they contained the right information, it could be their breakthrough. We'll go through them carefully, Clint said. Every document, every piece of information could be a clue, but we have to be smart about it. No mistakes. They spent the next few hours combing through the files, looking for any connection to the larger network Clint suspected. There were reports, names, and dates that all seemed meaningless at first glance, but slowly, the pieces began to form a picture. Clint's eyes narrowed as he studied one of the documents more closely. It was a list of people connected to Hardwick's operations, but what caught Clint's attention was a name, an influential politician whose career had been built on public trust and respect. This doesn't make sense, Clint muttered. Why would Hardwick be involved with someone like him? He's untouchable. Or so it seems. Jessica moved closer, peering over Clint's shoulder. What do you mean? Clint pointed to the name on the list. This man has connections at the highest levels of government. If he's involved in this, then it's much bigger than we thought. Peter let out a low whistle. We're talking about corruption at the highest levels. Clint's mind raced. This wasn't just about a few bad actors. It was a systematic issue, one that reached into the very core of the government. They were going to need more than just documents to take this down. They would need hard evidence, something irrefutable. We have to get to him, Clint said, his voice full of resolve. If we can expose him, we can bring the whole network down. But we have to be careful. If Hardwick and the USSS are involved, they're going to be watching every move we make. The room fell into a tense silence as they processed what Clint had just said. The danger was real, and it was growing by the second. But Clint wasn't about to back down. They were getting closer to the truth, and that was worth any risk. He turned to Jessica and Peter. Get some rest. We leave at dawn. We'll find this politician and make him talk. It's time to put the pieces together. As Clint lay down on the cot, his mind continued to race. He couldn't afford to let his guard down, not now. Not when everything they'd worked for was on the line. But as exhaustion finally overtook him, Clint drifted into a restless sleep, knowing that the next day would be their biggest challenge yet. And the stakes were higher than ever. The first light of dawn crept through the cracks in the blinds, casting long shadows across the room. Clint stirred, feeling the weight of the night's events pressing down on him. He had hardly slept, his mind buzzing with the name on the list, the politician who had suddenly become a key figure in the web of corruption he was uncovering. Clint had spent hours in the quiet of the safe house, going over everything he knew so far. Hardwick, the USSS agent, and now a high-profile politician. It all pointed to a network of powerful figures who were willing to do anything to maintain their grip on power. But why? And what role did Hardwick play in all of this? He looked at the clock, 6 a.m. Time to move. Clint stood up, stretching his stiff muscles. He wasn't about to let the danger slow him down. In fact, the closer they got to the truth, the more determined he became. They had a target now. The politician's name was Thomas Langford, a senator who had been in office for decades. He was a familiar face, beloved by the public for his charitable work and his smooth, charismatic persona. But Clint knew better now. Those who seemed the most untouchable often had the most to hide. Jessica and Peter were already awake, preparing for the day ahead. There was an air of tension among them, the weight of what they were about to do hanging over their heads. They had no idea what kind of trouble they were walking into, but Clint wasn't about to let fear dictate their moves. "We need to get to Langford's office," Clint said, his voice sharp with purpose. "We'll start there. The deeper we go, the more we'll uncover. But we can't waste time. He'll have people watching his every move, so we need to be cautious." Jessica nodded. "Got it. What's the plan?" Clint thought for a moment. "We're going in under the radar. No flashy moves. We gather intel, see what we can find. Langford has to have a paper trail, something linking him to Hardwick and the others. If we can find it, we can bring him down." Peter, ever the realist, raised an eyebrow. "And if we can't? If Langford's smart, he'll have covered his tracks well." "We'll make him slip up," Clint replied, a determined glint in his eyes. "Everyone has a weakness. We just have to find it." The group quickly gathered their things and headed out. They were about to enter the lion's den, and Clint could feel the tension building as they made their way to Langford's office in the heart of the city. As they arrived at the towering glass building where Senator Langford had his office, Clint's mind was already racing. They had to be discreet. No unnecessary attention. There was no telling how many people Langford had working for him, people who would protect him at all costs. And if they weren't careful, their mission could end in disaster. They parked a few blocks away and made their way on foot. As they neared the building, Clint couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Every turn, every step, felt like it could be their last. But he pushed the fear aside. They had a job to do. Entering the building was surprisingly easy. The lobby was bustling with activity, people coming and going, not paying much attention to them. They moved with purpose, like they belonged. Clint had done this kind of thing before, slipping into places where they weren't supposed to be, getting the information they needed without raising alarms. Langford's office was on the top floor, a symbol of his position. Clint knew they couldn't just waltz in there uninvited. He looked at Jessica and Peter. "You two go up first. I'll follow and keep watch. Get what you can, and don't draw attention." They nodded and split off, heading toward the elevator. Clint waited by the security desk, keeping his eyes on the room and the people inside. It didn't take long before the elevator doors opened, and Jessica and Peter stepped out, trying to appear like any other visitors. Clint slipped into the elevator right behind them, his nerves tightening as they ascended to the top floor. The elevator moved slowly, the hum of the machinery ringing in his ears. The closer they got to Langford's office, the more the adrenaline kicked in. They were getting closer to the truth, but they were also getting closer to danger. When the doors finally opened, they stepped out into a hallway lined with sleek, modern offices. The walls were adorned with portraits of Langford at various charity events, smiling with powerful figures. Everything about the place screamed power and influence. Jessica and Peter moved silently, keeping a careful distance from one another as they made their way toward Langford's office. Clint lingered behind them, making sure no one noticed them. The hallway was empty, but Clint's senses were on high alert. Any second, someone could walk around the corner, and the whole plan would be blown. Finally, they reached the door to Langford's office. Jessica glanced at Clint, her face tense. Clint nodded and motioned for her to go ahead. She twisted the doorknob, but it was locked. Peter stepped forward, pulling out a small set of lockpicks. He worked quickly, his hands steady as he manipulated the lock. Within moments, the door clicked open. Inside, the office was immaculate. A large desk sat in the center, with piles of paperwork neatly arranged on one side. Behind the desk, the windows offered a breathtaking view of the city below. Everything about the space screamed power, wealth, and control. Jessica and Peter immediately began searching through the papers on the desk, while Clint kept watch by the door. He could hear the faint sound of footsteps in the hallway. His heart raced as he silently motioned for them to hurry. After a few tense minutes, Jessica pulled out a manila folder from a drawer. She flipped it open, her eyes scanning the contents. Clint's breath caught in his throat as he stepped closer. "Clint," Jessica whispered urgently, "you need to see this." Inside the folder were documents that made Clint's blood run cold. Contracts, payments, names of people connected to Hardwick and others in the network he had been chasing. But there was one piece of information that stood out above the rest. A meeting scheduled for the following week between Langford and someone Clint recognized. It was a high-level government official, someone who had been in the public eye recently for his controversial policies. "This is it," Clint muttered. "This is the proof we needed." But just as they were about to leave, a loud noise echoed from down the hall. Footsteps. Someone was coming. "Move," Clint hissed, his heart pounding. The trio rushed toward the door, but as they stepped into the hallway, they froze. A figure in a suit appeared at the far end of the corridor. It was one of Langford's bodyguards. Clint's mind raced. They had to make it out of here now. The sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway, growing louder by the second. Clint's heart thudded in his chest as he motioned urgently for Jessica and Peter to follow him. There was no time to waste. They couldn't afford to get caught now, not when they were so close to unraveling everything. "Go," Clint whispered, his voice barely audible over the pounding of his pulse. Jessica and Peter exchanged a quick, silent look, then darted for the staircase at the far end of the hall. Clint followed close behind, keeping a careful eye on the approaching figure. The bodyguard, clad in dark sunglasses and an earpiece, was moving quickly, and Clint could tell that he wasn't just a regular hired hand. He was a professional. They had to get out before he realized they didn't belong. They reached the stairwell just as the bodyguard rounded the corner. The door creaked as they slipped through, and Clint held his breath, hoping the sound wouldn't be enough to alert him. But it was too late. The bodyguard's head snapped in their direction, and for a split second, Clint thought they were done for. "Run," Clint hissed. The trio tore down the stairwell, their footsteps a chaotic rhythm as they descended several flights in a matter of seconds. The building was quiet, but Clint knew it wouldn't stay that way for long. They had to get to the ground floor and out onto the street before they were cornered. As they reached the bottom of the stairwell, Clint pushed open the door to the lobby, heart racing. He quickly scanned the room, looking for any sign of the bodyguard or other security. The lobby was crowded, people coming and going, oblivious to the tension that had just unfolded. "Blend in," Clint muttered, his voice low. "We need to look like we belong." Jessica and Peter nodded, slipping into the crowd. Clint kept his eyes on the entrance, watching for any signs of trouble. They couldn't afford to make any mistakes now. If they got caught, the entire operation would be compromised. Just as they reached the doors, Clint glanced back over his shoulder and saw the bodyguard exiting the stairwell, his eyes scanning the room. Clint's stomach dropped. There was no way they'd make it out unnoticed. "Quick," Clint urged, pushing open the door and stepping out onto the street. They were free, for now, but Clint knew they couldn't stop. Not yet. They had the evidence, the names, the documents, but the real work was just beginning. Langford's people would be coming for them soon, and they had to stay one step ahead. As they walked quickly down the street, Clint's mind raced with the implications of what they'd found in Langford's office. The documents, the meeting, the names connected to Hardwick's operation. They had a target now, someone they could go after. But there was still so much they didn't know. "We need to get somewhere safe," Clint said, his voice urgent. "We'll go over the files again and figure out our next move." Peter nodded. "Where to?" "I have a place," Clint said, already pulling out his phone to send a quick message. "It's not far, but we need to move fast. They'll be looking for us soon." It wasn't long before they arrived at the small apartment Clint had been using as a temporary safe house. It was tucked away in a nondescript part of the city, a place that didn't attract attention. Clint let them in, then immediately went to the desk, spreading the documents out before them. "All right," he said, his voice steady but his mind still racing. "We have to figure out who's pulling the strings. Langford's the key. He's connected to Hardwick, and if we can prove that, we can take them both down." Jessica and Peter sat down beside him, their faces tense as they examined the files. Clint flipped through the pages, looking for anything that stood out, any hint that could tie Langford to the larger conspiracy. It wasn't long before Jessica found something. "Look at this," she said, tapping a document. "It's a list of donors to Langford's campaign. But here, these names, they've also made large donations to some of the companies Hardwick controls." Clint's brow furrowed. "That's it. That's the connection." Peter leaned forward, his eyes widening as he scanned the information. "This is big. If we can show that Langford's been taking money from Hardwick's people, it's game over." Clint nodded. "We need more than just donations. We need proof that he's been involved in the illegal activities. We need to find the meeting that's scheduled for next week and make sure we're there. If we can catch them in the act." Jessica glanced at Clint. "You think they'll actually meet? That's a huge risk for them." Clint's gaze darkened. "They're too arrogant. They think they're untouchable. And that's exactly why we can expose them." They spent the next few hours going over the files, piecing together a timeline of events. The meeting between Langford and the government official was the linchpin. If they could show that Langford was using his political power to cover up Hardwick's crimes, it would bring the whole operation crashing down. But time was running out. They had to act fast. "Let's get some rest," Clint said finally, rubbing his eyes. "We've got a long day ahead of us. We need to be ready." The following day, Clint and his team prepared for what was to come. They would stake out Langford's meeting, gather the evidence they needed, and then go public. It was risky, but it was the only way. Clint knew they were playing a dangerous game. If Langford and Hardwick caught wind of what they were doing, they would stop at nothing to silence them. But Clint wasn't going to back down. Not when they were this close to taking down the whole network. He glanced at Jessica and Peter, who were preparing their gear. "We've come this far," Clint said, his voice resolute. "No turning back now." As they loaded into the car, Clint's thoughts turned to the stakes of their mission. This wasn't just about justice. This was about survival. And Clint was ready to see it through, no matter what it took. The sun dipped low in the sky, casting an eerie orange glow over the city. Clint felt the weight of the day press upon him. Tonight wasn't just another operation. It was the turning point. They had the evidence, they had the names, and they had the moment they'd been waiting for. Langford's secret meeting. But the real danger lay ahead. If they could catch Langford and the government official in the act, it would be the breakthrough they needed. If they failed, they would be exposed, and everything they'd worked for would come crumbling down. The team had set up camp at a nondescript building across the street from the venue where the meeting was scheduled to take place. They were high enough up that they could see the entire entrance and every car that pulled up. Clint checked the time, 7:30 p.m. The meeting was set for 8 o'clock, but Clint wasn't taking any chances. He needed to be ready. Jessica, Peter, and Clint were all in position. They had a clear line of sight to the venue's main entrance, but they had to be cautious. They couldn't let anyone see them. They couldn't afford any slip-ups. "Any sign of Langford yet?" Clint asked, his voice low, focused. Jessica, scanning the crowd with binoculars, shook her head. "Nothing yet, but it's still early." Clint sat back in his chair, his eyes trained on the entrance. The minutes seemed to stretch on forever. His mind raced through scenarios. What if Langford didn't show? What if the meeting was a setup? What if Hardwick was on to them and had already moved the meeting? Clint couldn't afford to let doubt creep in. He had to stay sharp. Peter, fiddling with the equipment on his lap, broke the silence. You ever get the feeling they know we're watching? Clint gave him a sideways glance, his brow furrowing. What do you mean? Peter tilted his head toward the building. I mean, they're not exactly being subtle. A lot of people walking in and out, almost like they're trying to cover up something. Clint studied the entrance again. There was a lot of traffic for a place that was supposed to be private. He hadn't thought about it before, but now that Peter mentioned it, it felt off. Stay alert, Clint said, his voice steady. We're not the only ones watching. Just then, a black SUV pulled into the parking lot in front of the building, and Clint's breath caught in his throat. It was too early for anyone to be arriving for the meeting, but the SUV, its tinted windows, was unmistakable. The car was one of Hardwick's, a vehicle Clint had seen on multiple occasions during his investigation. He turned to Jessica. Do you see that? Clint asked, his voice tight. She didn't need to ask what he was talking about. She was already looking through the binoculars, her hand gripping the focus knob tightly. She nodded. That's Hardwick's SUV. No doubt about it. Damn it, Clint muttered. This was bad. Hardwick showing up early meant one thing. He was preparing for something big. The meeting wasn't just between Langford and the government official anymore. This was something much more dangerous. As the SUV parked, Clint's eyes never left the vehicle. He couldn't afford to miss a detail. A few seconds passed, and then the door to the SUV opened. Hardwick stepped out first, looking as composed as ever in his tailored suit. But Clint knew better than to trust the calm demeanor. Beside Hardwick, another figure emerged, a man Clint didn't recognize at first. But when he stepped into the light, Clint's blood ran cold. It was Senator Langford. Clint's heart skipped a beat. Langford had arrived early, too. But it wasn't just Langford. There was someone else with him. A man in a dark gray suit, looking just as out of place as Langford. Clint's mind whirred as he tried to make sense of it all. Jessica, Peter, do you see who's with him? Clint asked, his voice tense. Jessica leaned forward, peering through the binoculars. She took a few seconds to process the image before responding, her voice low. It's the government official, the one who was supposed to meet Langford. His name's Thomas Finch. He's the Secretary of State. Clint felt a chill run down his spine. Thomas Finch was one of the highest-ranking officials in the country, and he was supposed to be clean. This made no sense. The higher the stakes, the more dangerous this was becoming. The walls were closing in around them. We need to get closer, Clint said, his voice steely with resolve. We can't let them see us, but we need to get enough footage to make sure we have proof of what's going down. Peter nodded. I'll start setting up the long-range mic. If they're talking, we'll hear it. Clint quickly grabbed his gear and followed Jessica and Peter as they made their way out of the van and toward the building across the street. They needed to blend in, act like ordinary people. But the tension in Clint's gut told him that nothing was ordinary about this operation. Inside the building, the atmosphere was tense. Langford, Hardwick, and Finch entered the private meeting room, the door shutting behind them. Clint watched through the small gap in the door from his vantage point, trying to make out what they were saying. But the conversation was muffled. They had to get closer. Clint looked at Jessica and Peter, signaling them to follow. They moved carefully, staying in the shadows, avoiding the security cameras, and watching for any guards. The building's interior was sleek and modern, but Clint wasn't distracted by its polished appearance. They made their way down the hall, each step deliberate. Clint's hand instinctively went to the weapon on his hip. There was a chance they'd be caught, but he wasn't about to let them walk out of here without the truth. Finally, they reached the meeting room. Clint peered through the frosted glass. The three men were sitting at a table, their voices still too quiet to make out clearly. But there was one thing Clint was certain of. They weren't talking about policy. He turned to Jessica, her face a mirror of his own determination. We're going in. The door clicked open with a soft creak, and Clint, followed closely by Jessica and Peter, slipped into the room. For a moment, time seemed to freeze as the three men looked up at them in surprise. Hardwick's gaze flickered with recognition, but before he could react, Clint pulled out the documents they had found in Langford's office and slammed them onto the table. "Game's over," Clint said, his voice cold. Langford's face drained of color. Hardwick's jaw clenched. And Finch, well, Finch looked like he had just seen a ghost. The trap had been set, and Clint had just walked right into the heart of it. The room erupted into chaos. Clint's heart was pounding as he stood firm, his weapon steady in his hand, the barrel still smoking from the shot he'd fired into the ceiling. The two men who had entered the room, Hardwick's reinforcements, were now visibly shaken, their hands hovering over their own guns but not quite daring to draw them. The power had shifted in an instant. Clint could feel it. He knew they had the upper hand, but only for a moment. Langford, still sitting at the table, was the first to react. His eyes were wide, his face pale with disbelief. Hardwick, ever the strategist, recovered quickly and glared at Clint, his fists clenched at his sides. But it was Finch, the Secretary of State, who made the next move. His hand shot out toward the phone on the table, as if he were about to dial for help. "No," Clint shouted, stepping forward and slamming his hand down on the phone. "Not so fast, Finch." Finch jerked back, his expression a mix of fury and panic. "You've gone too far, Eastwood. You have no idea what you're up against. You're dead if you think you can walk out of here alive." Clint didn't flinch. He had come too far to back down now. "I don't need to walk out alive. I just need to make sure the truth gets out." Suddenly, the door behind them slammed open again, and two more armed men rushed in. Clint didn't hesitate. His instincts kicked in, and he fired two quick shots, one at the ceiling to get their attention, the other at the floor near their feet. The men froze. "Don't move," Clint barked, his gun trained on them. He could feel his pulse racing in his ears. "This ends now. Everyone on the floor. Hands where I can see them." The two new men hesitated, but slowly dropped to their knees, their hands in the air. Jessica and Peter quickly moved into position, covering the door and making sure no one else was about to walk in. Clint turned to Hardwick, his voice cold as steel. "This isn't a negotiation. You're done. Your people are done. This empire you've built? It's over." Hardwick's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. His mind was clearly racing, calculating his next move. But Clint wasn't going to give him the chance. "Jessica," Clint said, his eyes never leaving Hardwick, "get those documents ready. We need to send them now." Jessica didn't hesitate. She grabbed the stack of files off the table and handed them to Peter, who immediately began to upload the files onto a secure server. Clint could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He knew they didn't have much time. Hardwick and Langford weren't going to sit back and let this happen without a fight. "You think you're going to walk out of here with all that evidence and live to tell the tale?" Hardwick spat, his voice dripping with venom. "You're not just fighting me, Eastwood. You're fighting the whole system. The moment you leave this room, you'll have 100 men after you." Clint's eyes narrowed. "Let them come. I'm ready for them." As Peter finished uploading the files, he turned to Clint. "It's done. They're out there now. There's no turning back." Clint gave a brief nod of approval. They had what they came for. But now, they had to escape. And escaping was never easy when you were up against enemies like Hardwick and Langford. "You think you can just walk out of here?" Langford's voice trembled, but there was a thread of desperation in his tone. "You think you've won? You have no idea what kind of power you're messing with." Clint didn't respond. He turned to Jessica and Peter. "We move now. Stay close and watch each other's backs." As they made their way toward the door, Clint could hear the low rumble of footsteps outside the room. Reinforcements were coming. He could feel the pressure building, but he kept his movements calm, calculated. Every step they took was one closer to safety. Just as they reached the door, a voice from behind called out. "You won't get far, Eastwood," Hardwick said, his voice low but menacing. "You can't outrun the law. You can't outrun me." Clint didn't look back. "We'll see about that." They burst out into the hallway, Clint leading the way, his gun still ready. The building was a maze of sterile, white-walled corridors, but Clint had memorized the layout during his previous surveillance. He knew exactly where they needed to go. They moved swiftly, with purpose, but the sound of footsteps grew louder. Hardwick wasn't wasting time. The pursuit was already underway. At the end of the hall, Clint spotted the fire exit. He motioned to the team. This way. They reached the door, but as Clint grabbed the handle, it swung open. Two more of Hardwick's men standing there, guns raised. Clint's mind raced, calculating his next move. He couldn't hesitate now. Down, he shouted. Without thinking, he dove to the ground, taking out one of the men with a shot to the leg. Jessica followed his lead, using her agility to avoid the gunfire and take cover behind a nearby pillar. Peter wasn't far behind, firing at the remaining assailant and forcing him to retreat. Clint pushed himself back up, adrenaline coursing through his veins. Move. Now. The team didn't hesitate. They pushed through the fire exit and into the dark alley behind the building. Clint's mind raced as he scanned the area. They couldn't risk staying in the open for too long. Vehicles on the corner. Peter shouted. He was already halfway down the alley, heading for the parked car. Clint didn't waste any time. They had to get out before Hardwick's men could regroup. He followed Peter, with Jessica close behind. They reached the car, and Peter quickly started the engine. The screech of tires against the pavement rang in Clint's ears as they sped off into the night. Clint leaned back in the seat, his heart still hammering in his chest. They were out, but the danger wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Behind them, the building they had just escaped from was already being surrounded by reinforcements, but Clint knew they had bought themselves a window big enough to disappear, big enough to make sure the evidence would reach the right people. For now, they were safe. But the storm was just beginning. The engine roared as Peter's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, the tires screeching against the asphalt as they tore down the darkened streets. Clint sat in the back, his eyes scanning every corner, every street lamp, alert for any sign of pursuit. Jessica was beside him, her face set in grim determination, while Peter kept his focus on the road, driving like a man possessed. They had managed to escape, but the danger wasn't over. The chase had only just begun. Clint knew Hardwick and Langford wouldn't let this go. Not after everything they had at stake. They would come for them, and they would come fast. How much time do we have? Clint asked, his voice steady but laced with urgency. Peter didn't answer immediately, his eyes darting to the rearview mirror. He gritted his teeth. Hardwick won't stop. He has people everywhere. We need to be off the grid, and we need to do it now. Clint nodded, his mind racing. They needed to disappear. Fast. And the only way to do that was to get far enough away from the city. Far enough that no one could track them down. But first, they had to lose anyone tailing them. And Clint knew they weren't alone. Turn left here, Clint directed, pointing to an intersection up ahead. Peter didn't hesitate, and the car swerved sharply to the left, narrowly avoiding a parked truck. The headlights from the car behind them flashed in the rearview mirror, confirming what Clint already knew. They had been spotted. Someone's on us, Jessica said, her voice calm but tense. They're not far behind. Clint turned to her, his eyes narrowing. We need to make this more interesting. Hold on. He slid his hand into his jacket pocket, pulling out the tracking device they'd picked up earlier in the day. It wasn't much, but it would serve its purpose. Clint quickly activated it, and a small screen lit up in his hand. We have 2 cars on us, Clint said, his gaze fixed on the tracker. They've split up. They're trying to box us in. Peter's knuckles whitened as he gripped the wheel tighter. We'll have to shake them. Clint glanced out the window again. There was an alley coming up on the right. There. Turn right, and then we'll take the next left. Peter didn't need further instruction. He threw the car into a hard right, the tires screeching as they slid into the narrow alley. The sound of pursuing vehicles followed closely behind, and Clint knew that the chase had entered its final phase. We need a distraction, Clint said. Jessica, take the wheel for a second. Without waiting for a response, he reached into the glove compartment and pulled out a handful of small, metallic objects. He tossed them into the back seat. Pull over in the next minute. I'll set something up. Jessica caught the objects, her eyes widening slightly as she realized what Clint was about to do. You're kidding me. It's our best shot, Clint said with a grim smile. They're not the only ones who can play dirty. As the car raced down the alley, Clint quickly began assembling the small devices. It wasn't much, but it was enough to cause a diversion. He placed the first device under the car, securing it quickly before moving to the back. He didn't have much time. The sounds of the pursuing cars were growing louder. The alley they were speeding down was coming to a dead end, and there was no turning back. "Ready," Clint said, looking up as the end of the alley approached. Jessica slammed on the brakes. The car screeched to a halt. "Get out," Clint ordered, pulling open the back door. Jessica and Peter didn't question him. They jumped out, following Clint's lead. They crouched low, staying behind the car as Clint placed the last of the devices on the back of the vehicle, just as the first of Hardwick's cars appeared at the mouth of the alley. Clint had planned for this moment. The devices were designed to give off a bright flash and a loud noise, a perfect distraction to blind and disorient their pursuers, giving them the time they needed to escape. "Now!" Clint shouted. He flipped the switch on the last device, and a brilliant flash erupted from the back of the car. The noise that followed was deafening, an explosion of sound that rang through the night. The two cars pursuing them screeched to a halt, their drivers momentarily blinded by the flash. The sound of metal grinding against the pavement and tires skidding filled the air. "Go!" Clint yelled. They didn't waste a second. Clint, Jessica, and Peter sprinted down the alley, weaving through the shadows and away from the chaos they'd left behind. They didn't look back. They couldn't afford to. They reached the street at the end of the alley, ducking behind a dumpster. Clint's heart was racing, but his focus never wavered. He knew that time was running out. They needed to get to a safe location, and fast. Clint pulled out the tracker again, glancing at it briefly. "We've lost them for now, but it won't last long. We need to get to the drop point before they regroup." Peter nodded. "I've got the car parked a few blocks away. We'll lay low for a while." Clint took a deep breath, trying to calm the adrenaline pumping through his veins. They had bought themselves some time, but it was only a matter of time before Hardwick and his men regrouped. They would keep coming, but Clint was ready. He had one thing they didn't: proof. Proof that would bring down everything they'd worked so hard to build. He turned to his team, his voice steady but urgent. "Let's move." The rain had started to fall as Clint, Jessica, and Peter made their way through the empty streets, their steps quick but careful. The city seemed almost deserted, its usual hustle replaced by a quiet unease. Clint could feel it, the weight of their situation. They were on borrowed time, and every second brought them closer to being found. "How far are we?" Clint asked, his voice low as he glanced up at the darkened sky. Peter, ahead of them, didn't look back as he answered. 2 blocks. There's a safe house there. It's been off the grid for years. Should be clean." Clint nodded. He had no choice but to trust Peter. The safe house was their best shot at staying off Hardwick's radar for a while, but he knew it wouldn't be long before they were found. Hardwick wasn't the type to give up easily. And if there was one thing Clint knew about people like Hardwick, it was that they always had eyes everywhere. The rain began to fall harder, and Clint quickened his pace, determined to reach the safe house before the storm turned into something worse. As they neared the block where the safe house was supposed to be, the distant sound of sirens reached Clint's ears. The familiar wail of police cars grew louder, and his stomach tightened. They were close. "Shit," Jessica muttered, her eyes scanning the shadows. "They're getting closer." Clint didn't reply. He kept moving forward, his mind racing. If the police were in on this, they could be leading Hardwick's men straight to them. They had to be careful. One wrong move, and it would all be over. They rounded the corner and stopped in front of an old, abandoned building. The windows were boarded up, and the door looked like it hadn't been touched in years. Clint didn't hesitate. He approached the door, knocking in a particular rhythm. 3 short taps, followed by 2 long ones. There was a pause, and then the door creaked open just enough to reveal a pair of eyes peering through the crack. "Clint?" the voice asked, gruff but familiar. "Yeah, it's me," Clint said, his voice steady but urgent. "We need to move now." The door opened wider, and a tall, broad-shouldered man stepped aside, allowing them to slip inside. The safe house wasn't much, just a small, sparse room with a few cots and a single table. But it was secure, and for now, that was all that mattered. The door slammed shut behind them, and the man who had let them in, a former colleague of Clint's, locked it with a heavy bolt. "You've got some serious heat on you," he said, eyeing the trio. "What happened?" Clint didn't waste time with pleasantries. "We've got evidence that can bring Hardwick down, but his men are after us. The police, the feds, they're all involved." The man raised an eyebrow. "That's some serious firepower you're talking about." "It is," Clint agreed, pacing the room. "But we've got the upper hand for now. We just need time." "Time's not something you've got a lot of," the man replied, crossing his arms. "Hardwick will be on you within hours. You need to lay low." Clint nodded. "We're doing that now, but we need to get the information out. People need to know what's been going on." Jessica stepped forward. "I've already sent the files to a few contacts. We've covered our bases." "Good," Clint said, turning to her. "But we need to stay one step ahead of them. Hardwick won't stop until we're dead." The man gave a dry chuckle. "I don't know if that's what he wants, but I know he won't stop until you're out of the picture." Clint's gaze hardened. "We won't let him take us down." As Clint surveyed the room, he began to plan their next steps. They had lost their lead, but they couldn't afford to give up. The evidence was still out there, and it was only a matter of time before it reached the right people. The world needed to know the truth about Hardwick's empire. But as Clint stood there, his mind racing, a thought struck him. "How much do we trust the people we've sent the files to?" he asked, his voice sharp. Jessica exchanged a look with Peter. "I trust them," she said quietly. "They're solid." Clint didn't look convinced. "We don't know who's on the other end of those emails. We don't know who might be watching." Peter spoke up, his voice steady but worried. "We can't be sure of anything right now, Clint, but we have to trust someone. And these people, they've got the resources to get the information out there." Clint exhaled sharply. "For now, I'll trust them. But we need to make sure it's safe. We can't let Hardwick get his hands on it." The man who had let them in cleared his throat, pulling Clint's attention. "I've got a safe location upstate," he said. "It's a few hours away. You can lay low there, but you'll need to leave soon." Clint turned to Jessica and Peter. "What do you think?" "We don't have much of a choice," Jessica said. "We need to keep moving." Peter nodded in agreement. "We've stayed here long enough." Clint felt the pressure of the decision weighing on him. They couldn't stay in one place for too long. But the safe house had served its purpose, giving them a brief respite, a moment to plan. "We go upstate," Clint decided. "But we have to be smart. We can't make it easy for Hardwick." The man who had helped them nodded. "I'll give you everything you need. Supplies, maps, everything. But you've got to move fast. The longer you stay, the higher the risk." Clint turned to Jessica and Peter. "Pack up. We leave in 10. As they quickly gathered what little they needed, Clint couldn't help but feel the weight of the situation. They were out of options, running out of time, and the walls were closing in. But Clint had made it this far. He wasn't going to stop now. "We stick together," Clint said, his voice resolute. "We keep moving. We don't let Hardwick win." They were on the edge of something bigger than they had ever imagined. And Clint knew one thing for certain. He was going to take Hardwick down, no matter the cost. The journey upstate was grueling. The rain never seemed to stop, and the roads were slick with water. But Clint couldn't afford to dwell on the discomfort. The stakes were higher now than ever before. The information they carried, the files on Hardwick, was their last chance. It was the only weapon they had left, and they couldn't afford to lose it. Clint sat in the back seat, staring out the window, his mind racing. He knew the odds were stacked against them. Hardwick wasn't just dangerous, he was powerful. If they didn't act quickly, the truth they had could be buried forever. And once that happened, there was no telling how many more lives would be destroyed. Peter was behind the wheel, his grip tight, eyes focused. Jessica sat beside him, her face pale, but determined. She had been quiet for most of the ride, lost in her thoughts. Clint knew she was thinking the same thing. Time was running out. The car's headlights cut through the darkness as they drove through desolate country roads. It felt like they were heading further into nowhere, far from the city, far from any help. This was their last refuge, and Clint had no illusions. They were in the lion's den now. "Almost there," Peter muttered, glancing at the rearview mirror. Clint nodded, but his gaze never wavered from the road ahead. Something didn't sit right. The further they got from the city, the more uneasy he became. It was too quiet. No sirens. No lights. Not even any other cars on the road. Suddenly, the hair on the back of his neck stood up. He turned to Jessica. "Stay alert," he said, his voice low. "I've got a bad feeling about this." Jessica looked at him, her face tight. "You think they found us?" "I don't know, but we're too exposed. If Hardwick's men are tracking us, we'll be easy targets out here." Peter frowned. "We're almost there. Just a few more miles." Clint glanced out the window again. The wind howled through the trees, and the landscape around them seemed to close in, the shadows growing longer. The tension in the car was palpable. Clint's instincts told him they weren't going to make it to the safe house without a fight. Hardwick wasn't going to let them disappear. "Turn here," Clint said suddenly. Peter swerved the car left onto a narrow dirt road that was barely visible in the rain. He glanced at Clint, his face questioning. "What's going on?" "There's a small cabin up ahead," Clint said. "It's off the radar. We need to regroup." Peter didn't argue. He took the turn and accelerated, the tires kicking up gravel. The rain pounded harder against the windshield, and Clint could barely make out the shape of a building in the distance. As they approached the cabin, Clint's eyes flicked nervously to the rearview mirror. There was nothing there, no headlights in the distance. But that didn't ease the knot in his stomach. They pulled up to the cabin, and Clint's heart skipped a beat. There was no sign of anyone. No cars parked nearby. No signs of life. "Stay here," Clint ordered. "I'm going inside first." Before either of them could protest, Clint opened the car door and stepped into the mud. The cold rain splashed against him, but he didn't flinch. He approached the cabin cautiously, his hand on the gun tucked inside his jacket. He reached the door, carefully testing the knob. It was locked. He pulled out a small tool from his pocket, picked the lock, and pushed the door open. The cabin was small, dimly lit by a flickering light in the corner. Clint's eyes scanned the room, looking for anything out of place. The room was empty, save for some old furniture and a few scattered boxes. But there was something off, a sense of unease that crept up his spine. "Clear," Clint called over his shoulder. He motioned for Jessica and Peter to follow. They stepped inside, and Clint closed the door behind them. He moved to the window, peering through the rain-streaked glass. "We're safe for now," Clint said, but there was no relief in his voice. "But we can't stay long." Peter, who had been silent for most of the drive, finally spoke. "What now?" Clint's eyes locked onto Peter's. "Now we find a way to get this information out to the right people. Hardwick will be coming for us, and we need to make sure he doesn't win." Jessica crossed the room and pulled out her phone, tapping furiously. "I've got a few contacts left who might be able to get this out there. But we'll need to be careful. Hardwick has a network everywhere." Clint nodded. "We'll be careful, but we can't keep running forever. It's time to play the game." Peter paced the room, his anxiety palpable. "We need to be prepared for a fight. We've been running, but Hardwick's not going to stop. And neither are the people he's got in his pocket. We'll fight when we have to," Clint said, his tone hardening. "But not until we're ready." Jessica finished texting and put her phone down. "I've arranged a drop. Someone will be there tomorrow morning with a secure way to get the files to the right people." Clint raised an eyebrow. "You trust this person?" She hesitated, then nodded. "I trust them. But if it goes wrong, we need a plan B." "Always have a plan B," Clint muttered. "What's the drop point?" "An old warehouse near the docks," Jessica said. "It's secluded. Nobody goes there." Clint's gaze hardened. "It's too risky." "We don't have much of a choice," Peter said. "We can't wait around here forever." Clint took a deep breath. "All right, we'll head there tomorrow. But we need to keep our guard up. Hardwick's men will be looking for us." Jessica picked up a small bag and handed it to Clint. "If things go south, make sure you have what you need." Clint took the bag, his mind already running through the possible scenarios. It was going to be a long night, and they were far from out of danger. But they had made it this far, and they weren't going to stop now. Tomorrow was the final play. If they succeeded, they could expose Hardwick's empire once and for all. But if they failed, everything they had worked for would be lost. The air was thick with anticipation as Clint, Jessica, and Peter made their way through the dark, rain-soaked streets. The night had taken on an eerie stillness, punctuated only by the occasional rumble of thunder. The warehouse loomed ahead, its dark silhouette barely visible in the storm's relentless downpour. They were close, too close for comfort. Clint's instincts told him that this could be their last chance. If they didn't succeed tonight, there wouldn't be another. Clint adjusted the strap of the bag slung over his shoulder, feeling the weight of the files inside. These weren't just any documents. They were the keys to taking down one of the most powerful and dangerous men in the world. Hardwick's empire would crumble if the world learned the truth, but only if they could get the information to the right hands. The sound of their footsteps was drowned out by the storm, but Clint couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. He kept his eyes on the warehouse, scanning the perimeter. It was too quiet, too perfect. They reached the entrance of the warehouse, where an old, rusted door stood ajar. Jessica pushed it open with a creak, and the trio stepped inside. The warehouse was vast, filled with towering shelves and crates that cast long shadows under the dim lights. "Stay sharp," Clint whispered, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. "We don't know who's waiting for us." Peter moved to the side, his hand on the handle of his gun. Jessica was close behind, her eyes constantly darting around. Clint led the way, his every sense on high alert. He could feel the tension in the air, a sense of inevitability that weighed heavy on his chest. They hadn't gone far when a figure stepped out from behind one of the crates. Clint immediately recognized him, a man in his early 40s, wearing a dark suit and a grim expression. His posture was confident, but there was something unsettling about the way he moved. "Clint Eastwood," the man said, his voice smooth but cold. "I've been expecting you." Clint didn't flinch. "I thought you might be." The man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I have to admit, I didn't think you'd make it this far. But I suppose I underestimated you." Clint's hand hovered near his weapon. "Where's Hardwick?" The man's smile faded. "He's not here, but he's close. Very close." Before Clint could respond, a sound echoed from the far side of the warehouse. It was faint at first, but it grew louder, a steady thumping, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps. "Get down!" Clint shouted. They dove for cover as a barrage of gunfire erupted from the shadows. The air was filled with the deafening sound of bullets hitting metal and concrete. Clint's heart raced as he returned fire, his aim steady. The man in the suit ducked behind cover, but Clint knew they were outnumbered. "Peter, Jessica," Clint yelled, signaling to them to move. "We need to get to the back door." Peter was already on his feet, pushing Jessica ahead of him. Clint kept firing, his eyes scanning the warehouse for an escape route. But the more he fired, the more he realized they were trapped. There was no clear way out. "Hardwick's men are everywhere," Jessica said, her voice tight with panic. "We need to find cover and regroup." Clint's mind raced. The files in his bag were their only bargaining chip, and if they didn't get them to the right people, Hardwick would win. They couldn't afford to fail now. "We need to make a move," Clint said, his voice sharp. "We can't let them take us down. Follow me." Clint led the way, sprinting across the warehouse floor as the sound of gunfire grew closer. They reached a large stack of crates and ducked behind them for cover. Clint took a deep breath, his mind working fast. They were running out of time. "There's a back exit through the office," Peter said, looking around quickly. "If we can get to it, we can make it out." Clint nodded. "Let's go. Stay close." They made their way toward the office, moving swiftly but cautiously. Every step felt like it could be their last. Clint's eyes flicked back to the door, expecting Hardwick's men to burst in at any moment. But instead, it was the man in the suit who appeared in the doorway, his gun drawn. "Not so fast, Clint," he said, his voice dripping with smug satisfaction. Clint's pulse quickened, but he didn't hesitate. He drew his own gun, aiming straight at the man's chest. "You're too late," Clint said, his voice steady. "The files are already on their way." The man's smile faltered for a moment, but then he nodded, as if he had expected this. "Hardwick knew you'd be desperate, but you won't get away that easily. We've been watching you." Clint didn't waste any more time with words. He fired first, the shot echoing in the cold warehouse. The man in the suit dropped to the ground with a thud, his weapon falling from his hand. Jessica gasped, but Clint didn't allow himself to feel relief. "Let's move," he barked. They reached the office, but as they pushed through the door, Clint's worst fears were realized. A group of men, more of Hardwick's operatives, stood at the far end, blocking their escape route. "You really thought you could get away, Clint?" one of the men sneered, raising his weapon. "This ends tonight." Clint's hand tightened around his gun, his body instinctively taking a defensive stance. "This isn't over," he said through gritted teeth. The room was dead silent for a moment, each side calculating their next move. Then, just as Clint prepared to make a last stand, the unmistakable sound of sirens wailed in the distance. The operatives' faces twisted in confusion as they turned toward the noise. Before Clint could process what was happening, the back door of the warehouse burst open, and a group of federal agents swarmed in, guns raised. They moved quickly, disarming Hardwick's men with precision. Clint blinked in disbelief. The feds? How? A tall agent stepped forward, his expression grim but familiar. "We've been tracking Hardwick for years. He's been one step ahead of us for too long." Clint's heart leapt as he realized what was happening. The files, what they had risked everything for, were finally in the right hands. The agent looked at Clint. "You did good, Eastwood. We've got this from here." Clint nodded, but the weight of everything that had happened still pressed on him. "It's over then?" The agent paused. "It's just beginning." As the agents rounded up Hardwick's men and secured the warehouse, Clint allowed himself a moment of relief. The truth was finally out. Hardwick's empire was crumbling, and Clint knew that this was only the beginning of a long, hard battle. But for the first time in a long while, Clint felt like they might actually win. He turned to Jessica and Peter, his voice steady but filled with quiet gratitude. "We did it." Jessica smiled, though it was weary. "We did." And for the first time in a long time, Clint allowed himself to believe it was really over. They had taken down the monster. But in the world they lived in, that victory was just the first of many battles yet to come. The storm had passed, leaving only the remnants of its fury, wet streets, darkened skies, and an unsettling calm that followed. Clint stood in the rain-soaked parking lot, his gaze fixed on the federal agents as they swept through the warehouse. The storm had cleared, but in its wake, there was no sense of victory, no celebration. There was just the cold reality of what had happened. Hardwick's empire was crumbling, but the battle was far from over. Jessica and Peter had already left the warehouse, disappearing into the shadows of the rainy night. Clint, however, felt a pull to stay. Something was gnawing at him. He couldn't shake the feeling that the end of one fight was just the beginning of another. The tall federal agent who had led the charge toward Hardwick's men approached Clint, his demeanor more composed than before, but there was a certain weight to his expression. "Clint Eastwood," the agent said, his voice low. "I'm Agent Daniels. I think we owe you more than just a thank you." Clint didn't respond immediately. His mind was still racing. "Hardwick is going down," Clint said, his voice steady but tired. "But this won't be the last we hear from people like him. He's not the only one." Agent Daniels nodded, acknowledging Clint's truth. "You're right. Hardwick was just one part of a much bigger puzzle. But the intel you gave us, this changes everything. It's going to take us a while to fully untangle it all." Clint glanced back toward the agents inside, watching them gather evidence, make arrests. They were still in control for now, but Clint had seen how quickly things could spiral. "I didn't do this for recognition," Clint said, finally turning to face Agent Daniels. "I did it because I knew what he was capable of, and I knew how far he'd go to bury the truth." Daniels gave a half-smile, the first sign of warmth Clint had seen from him. "You've got a good head on your shoulders, Eastwood. We need more people like you. You're right about one thing. Hardwick's just the beginning. The network he built runs deep. We're going to need all the help we can get to keep the pressure on." Clint's instincts told him that this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The federal agent's words echoed in his mind. "We're going to need all the help we can get." "I don't work for the government," Clint replied bluntly. "I've got my own way of doing things." Daniels didn't seem offended by the response. "Fair enough. But think about this. Your fight isn't over." Hardwick was untouchable. He had connections everywhere. But now, with everything you've provided, We've got a real shot at taking down his entire operation. Clint looked past the agent toward the wreckage of the warehouse, the place where it all came to a head. He didn't want to be part of a bureaucratic operation, but he couldn't ignore the truth. The fight had grown beyond just him. "I'm done running," Clint muttered to himself. Daniels noticed Clint's demeanor shift. "What do you mean?" "I'm done running," Clint repeated, louder this time. "I'm done with the shadows, done with hiding. If we're really going to take this fight to the top, it won't be from the sidelines. I'll help you." The agent's expression softened, and he gave a nod of approval. "We could use someone like you. You know how this game is played." "I know exactly how it's played," Clint said, eyes narrowing as he thought about all the people who had been affected by Hardwick's actions. "But this time, it's not just about taking down one man. It's about taking down an entire system, a network that's been running unchecked for far too long." The agent extended his hand, a rare gesture of respect. "Then welcome to the team, Eastwood. We'll be in touch." Clint hesitated for a moment, but then shook Danielle's hand firmly. There was no going back now. Hardwick was gone, but the fight was far from over. This was the beginning of something much bigger. The next morning, Clint met with Jessica and Peter at a small cafe just outside the city. The sun had risen, casting a dull light on the wet streets, and the storm had finally relented. Despite the calm, Clint could sense the unease hanging in the air. They were safe, for now, but they knew it wasn't going to last. Jessica sipped her coffee, her eyes tired but sharp. "I can't believe it's finally over. Hardwick's men, the operation. It's all coming down." Clint nodded, but his mind wasn't on the victory. It was on what came next. "It's not over," he said, his voice heavy. "It's just beginning." Hardwick was only the face of the operation. There are others, people just as dangerous, just as powerful. We need to stay ahead of them. Peter looked out the window, his fingers tapping on the table nervously. "What's the plan, Clint? Are we still going to run from these guys, or are we standing and fighting?" Clint took a deep breath. "We're standing. We've got too much at stake now, but we do it on our terms." Jessica leaned forward, her expression resolute. "What does that mean for us, Clint?" "It means we fight back. We've got the truth now. We've got the evidence. Hardwick's downfall is just the first domino. We use that leverage. We keep pushing forward. We expose the network he built. We can't stop now." Peter exchanged a glance with Jessica before speaking. "But we'll need help. The kind of help we can't get on our own." Clint smiled grimly. "I'm not expecting to do this alone. There's a whole world of people who've been waiting for a chance to take Hardwick down. Now they've got one." Jessica looked down at her coffee cup, taking a deep breath. "This is bigger than we thought." Clint met her gaze. "Way bigger. But we've got the advantage now. The ball's in our court." As they sat there, the weight of the reality began to settle in. This wasn't just a battle, it was a war. And Clint knew that the cost would be high, but he was prepared. He had to be. There was no going back. Clint glanced out the window one last time, his thoughts already moving ahead. Hardwick was finished, but the war he had ignited was far from over. He'd learned a lot along the way. Trust was a fragile thing, loyalty even more so. But in the end, it wasn't about those things. It was about something deeper, a fight for justice, for truth. And no matter how deep the shadows went, Clint Eastwood wasn't going to stop. Not until it was finished. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?